Hello and welcome to A-Team Group's Data Management Summit Virtual 2021. We'd like to thank our platinum sponsors, SIX, Bureau van Dijk, QSIP Global Services and Tableau, our gold sponsors, Alatus, the Association of National Numbering Agencies, Solidatus, Albio, Didactics, Hyvera, the Derivatives Service Bureau, West Highland Support Services and Quantexa. Also our media and industry partners. You can connect with your peers on the networking page, and if you have questions for our speakers, please use the question panel to the right of the video. Thank you for attending and enjoy the summit.
Hello and welcome to today's event. This is Data Management Summit Virtual Day 2. My name is Andrew Delaney. I'm Chief Content Officer at A-Team Group and I will be hosting today's session. If you are new to us, i.e. you didn't join us yesterday, we'll be looking today at how to leverage data management capabilities to drive innovation in regulatory reporting, KYC, and onboarding. To help us in this task, we have recruited a great set of data management experts from across the industry, and you'll be hearing from them shortly. Before we get on with today's program, I'd like to thank all the speakers for taking the time, putting the work in, the preparation, and so on and so forth, and for their generosity in sharing their expertise with us. I think it's great testament to our industry that people are up for sharing, and it makes these extremely valuable. I'd also like to again thank the sponsors, platinum sponsors, Bureau van Dijk, QSIP Global Services, SIX and Tableau. Gold sponsors Anna, Alveo, Alatus, DSB, Hyvera, Solidatus, Quantexa and West Highland. These people who sponsor us make this event possible. So please do take the time to visit the sponsors section, kick the tires virtually, and find out how they can help you. That way they will be encouraged to come back and support another event, which we hope you find informative. Certainly we very much enjoy them, and they're great marketplace reach out for us. You can also see on the platform who else is attending, and you can network with peers and colleagues using our virtual platform. So please try and experiment a bit, connect with a few people and get maximum value out of today's session. Hot off the press, I've been told that our Entity Data Handbook is available now. That's a downloadable resource. It should be available if you click through at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. So that's a free download that you should take a look at your leisure. And finally, from me, we encourage you to get involved by voting in audience poll questions. For that, we use the Slido system. This is should be on to the right of the video that you can see. So you can also use Slido as well as using it to answer poll questions. You can ask questions of our presenters and panelists. Those questions will come to me and I'll work them into the conversation as I see fit. Okay, so that's all the housekeeping I need to talk about. I think we're going to take a short commercial break and then get on with the session.
Now in the securities world, each security has a unique identifier, and that's called a QSIP number.
Well, I think without established and entrenched standards, the markets would grind to a halt and fairly quickly. One of the more rewarding aspects of the work we do at CUSIP Global Services is our role in developing and promoting new standards. It's certainly not the most glamorous aspect of the financial information industry, but whether it's blockchain and digital securities and tokenized assets, what we've done with physical precious metals, listed options, and syndicated loans, we're really proud of our track record of not only the work we do ourselves, but also with colleagues within ANA and the ISO world to bring the precision and reliability of standards to sectors of the market that suffer for lack of the same.
I mean, having a unique identifier is absolutely critical for operational efficiency, risk management throughout the trade flow, right from research, trading, settlement, onto reporting as well. The majority of the industry takes unique identifiers for granted, but it's a little bit like electricity. We don't often stop to think about just quite how critical it is.
Welcome back. We're now going to kick off the session for today with a keynote from CUSIP Global Services. We're going to hear from Scott Priest, Matt Bastian, and Darren Purcell, and they're going to talk about the title of their presentation is Standing at the Intersection of Regulatory Need and Standards Development, a Standards Practitioner's View. They're going to talk about how the standards landscape has evolved, where future opportunities lie. They're going to look at how to apply data standards to drive regulatory reporting and compliance. And they're going to look about exploring market sectors that are ripe for standards innovations. So let's hear from Scott, Matt, and Darren now.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm Scott Price. I'm Managing Director and Global Head for CUSIP Global Services, also referred to as CGS, which is proudly operated for the American Bankers Association by S&P Global Market Intelligence. And after sharing some brief thoughts with you on today's topic, I'll introduce and hand off this session to two experienced market authorities in this segment, Darren Purcell, Senior Director for CGS in EMEA, and Matthew Bastian, Senior Director for CGS Market Development based in Seattle. And they'll touch on topics ranging from OTC derivatives to LEI to digital securities and even ESG. Now, today's program is entitled Standing at the Intersection of Regulatory Need and Standards Development, a Practitioner's View. And it's clear that as the world continues to face a significant shared challenge in COVID-19, the economic implications of the pandemic have rightly caused regulators and financial services firms alike to prioritize financial and operational resilience, including heightened focus on core and critical data sets. In our experience, the focus on financial and operational resiliency has placed even more reliance on existing data standards. And the panelists speaking today have broad practitioner experience on key standards development bodies and industry groups, both in the US through ANSI accredited X9, as well as global cross-border standards agencies like the International Organization for Standards, or ISO. If we can pivot to the next slide, please. Now, a recent survey of financial services CEOs conducted by PwC found that their top concern was the specter of over-regulation, with that concern actually ranking ahead of the perceived risk of uncertain economic growth, geopolitical risk, and even cybersecurity. And certainly our industry has seen its share of recent sweeping regulatory mandates, ranging from privacy and personal information legislation like GDPR to MiFID II, and the more narrowly tailored prohibitions like the no LEI, no trade clause that illuminates the very intersection of standardization and regulation that is our focus today. CUSIP Global Services has been at the forefront of standards development, adoption, implementation, and support for more than 50 years now. And among the now widely recognized standards that CGS has had a hand in developing and promoting is the 12-character ISIN, also known as ISO 6166 for cross-border securities identification, the cross-border product classification code known as the CFI, the financial instrument short name or FISIN standard for establishing a common nomenclature and record length for issuer and instrument descriptive data, and more recently, the legal entity identifier or LEI, a critical standard to uniquely identify legal entities that was born out of the credit crisis and the need to understand and mitigate entity linkage risk in the future. And many of these initiatives were driven and or supported by the senior level CUSIP Board of Trustees, a cross-section of industry leaders that work closely with CGS to consistently expand the reliability and certainty of the CUSIP system into new asset classes, geographies, and capabilities, such as improvements in system resiliency through cloud and AWS migration, as well as data and operational use of robotic process automation. And as you can see on the slide, the result has been a CUSIP system that, when considered on a global scale, encompassing the CUSIP International or SINs and ISIN systems, provides data and identification standards for more than 50 million financial instruments and their issuers. And CUSIP stands as a recognized interoperable language among a broad swath of market participants, including regulators, securities depositories, stock exchanges, data vendors, and banks. And so as I pivot to slide 3, I'll reintroduce Darren Purcell, the CUSIP Global Services Senior Director for all business in EMEA. Darren?
Thank you, Scott. When discussing the impact of new or updated regulations, we often focus on the impact to financial institutions, and rightly so. But I wanted to provide a brief inside view from our perspective as a data standards practitioner for over 50 years. As a national numbering agency for the US and over 30 other jurisdictions, a founding member of ANA, the Association of National Numbering Agencies, and co-operator of the ANA Service Bureau, responsible for the collection, aggregation, and distribution of the ISIN records from the global network of NNAs, and finally, a board member of the Derivative Service Bureau, we have been heavily involved in the intersection between data standards and regulations. MiFID II is an excellent example of regulators, in this case ESMA, working closely with ISO as the standards body, and data standards practitioners, including ANA. MiFID II's prescriptive use of data standards, in particular those that were mentioned by Scott, ISIN, CFI, FISN, and LEI, has had a lasting impact beyond the single individual use case of MiFID II. For example, the ISIN standard for MiFID II needed to be updated to include OTC instruments following to cover the asset classes needed for MiFID II, and resulted in ANA creating the Derivative Service Bureau with the financial backing of a few supporters and investors, including CGS. The CFI, again, the ISIN standard for the CFI code, also needed to be updated to include OTC instruments, but also required a major investment by global NNAs to improve the coverage and quality of CFI codes for non-OTC instruments. The FISN, the Financial Instrument Short Name, a relatively new ISO standard at the time of MiFID II, required an accelerated rollout by global NNAs to support the MiFID II deadline. And as Scott mentioned, the LEI, the legal entity identifier, required expanded coverage because, as we know, in Europe, no LEI, no trade. All of this creates momentum for change and improvements. ANA has a federated model with over 120 members and partners who are increasingly focused on data quality. As cooperators of the ANA Service Bureau, along with SIX Financial Information, we are upgrading the ASB infrastructure to support ANA and its members to improve coverage and quality of the ISIN records, including the CFI, FISN, and LEIs, plus the associated descriptive data. The upgrades include allowing the NNAs to communicate with each other, log and track data challenges that impact their local markets. And the momentum continues. Using the skills that NNAs developed linking and working with the LEI records, alongside their long-established LEI ISIN processes, Glyph and ANA were able to announce the availability of the new LEI to ISIN mapping file, available to download from the Glyph website for free, a project that CGS proudly supports and provides the mapping for hundreds of thousands of ISINs mapped to LEIs. Another example, the UPI, the Unique Product Identifier, is a new OTC identifier that has the backing of global regulators and is already included in new regulations in the pipeline over the next 12 to 18 months, including the US. Working closely with global regulators, the DSB, created because of MiFID II, will be used to manage both the UPI and OTC ISINs, supporting the global markets beyond the initial use case in Europe. The partnership between regulators, standards bodies, and data standards practitioners is delivering results at a speed not normally associated with data standards world of old, and hopefully that will continue. But with that, thank you, and I'll pass on to Matthew.
Thanks, Darren. So this section is going to touch on some of our strategic alliances. We have a long tradition over the years of partnering with market participants who may have subject matter expertise or access to unique content sets, and we work with them to bring new solutions to the market. So first is digital securities, and much has been written in recent years about blockchain, the technology platform behind Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, and now increasingly digital assets in general. We're of the mind that it's a flawed premise to view digital assets as a homogeneous class unto themselves. And the reason is that the blockchain is just a fancy new way of transferring and recording ownership. It does not confer any additional commonality among the various assets being tokenized, whether it's a security token, a piece of art, or a property deed. ICOs, for example, the initial coin offerings, had a frenzied run a few years ago until the bottom fell out of that market. And they were so troubling for regulators that the SEC set up a fake website called Howey Coins to point out some of the red flags associated with ICOs and for investors to keep in mind, whether it's buy now pressure, promise of guaranteed returns, or fictitious executives. For our part, we've been focused on digital securities, sometimes called TAOs or tokenized asset offerings. And this is through a partnership with Templum. They are an SEC registered broker dealer and ATS. And these are unregistered securities, usually Reg D or Reg A plus, but they still have an offering document for our operations staff to review. And that's a critical piece of the process for us, whether the security is book entry or trades on a blockchain. And security tokens aside, there has been a push at the ISO level to implement a new standard called the DTI, or Digital Token Identifier, and that's to help with unique identification of other types of tokens. And that standard should be published and up and running with an active registration authority later this year. The second item is a collaboration around ESG data, which is a hot topic among regulators and market participants alike. We worked with Acre Data, who has since been acquired by ISS, to map CUSIPs for municipal issuers to the GeoID identification schema used by the Census Bureau and other government agencies. And the GeoID identifies geographic areas by varying degrees of granularity, whether it's state, county, city, and all the way down to census tract and individual blocks. And then with that mapping in place, we can connect the ISS ESG scores to US municipal issuers. And these scores cover everything from healthcare and pollution metrics to infrastructure grades, and perhaps whether the community is next to a Superfund site. And the basic concept here is that if an investor owned a municipal bond in, say, Louisiana, and a hurricane is forming in the Gulf of Mexico, it would be good to know that risk exposure. Perhaps the ESG score for infrastructure is poor, and damaged roads and bridges could disrupt the income stream for that bond if it was a revenue bond. So that's the basic premise behind the collaboration with what is now ISS. We're really excited about this offering and its potential applications. And I'll hand it back over to Scott for some closing remarks.
Thank you, Matt. In wrapping up today's session, I want to highlight the recent reapproval of the CUSIP standard. As you can see, the CUSIP standard has been reaffirmed by ANSI accredited X9 each 5 years since 1976, when it first became an ANSI standard. You can also see some of the strong support for the CUSIP standard by leading market practitioners, including Anne-Marie Bria at DTCC, Michael Manbeck of Fidelity Investments, and Steve Stevens, Executive Director of ANSI accredited X9. And while the standards process has formalized, in some cases, the recognition of standards that are already in wide use, I do want to close with a note that participation by a majority of financial services firms has sharply declined in recent years. And in fact, in his recent white paper entitled Anatomy of a World-Class Standards Body, Cordell eminent scholar Jay Ritter writes, as a final point, we are concerned that engagement in the standards processes is waning and suggests the need for dedication to revitalize these efforts. Firms need to allocate young talent to engage in the debate. We are reinforcing our support of the process and invite you to be part of this collaborative effort. Now is the opportune moment to step up and enhance the baseline standards for both identification and unambiguous shared meaning. It is essential in the age of systemic risk and the core task of any world-class standards body. And ironically, that has been our message from CGS for several years now, as we observe disproportionate influence in the standards development process by a very small number of institutions that is not representative of the industry at large. So in closing, my message on behalf of CGS and our colleagues is to get involved in the standard setting process, get involved in ANSI accredited X9, in ISO, and in trade and industry associations that support those efforts. Thanks very much for your time. At this point, I'll hand it back to Andrew for some Q&A.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Scott, Matt, and Darren. Let's see, very, very interesting presentation. I was actually participating in a live stream with Matt on with the Templum relationship a little while back before we all got locked away in our lockdown. Absolutely fascinating initiative there. Darren, you're going to stick around for a couple of questions. Let me ask you something we've got off the Slido. So could you share a couple of use cases or examples of how standards are adding value beyond regulatory compliance? I think obviously that Templum one is one. Maybe a couple of others that you've seen?
Yeah, I think one of the key things to remember is that often the regulation is the foundation that accelerates the building of the standards. But then we see that within our whole ecosystem, the flow of data. So, for example, if we collect data from on a pre-trade basis from an offering document or prospectus, we are extracting out the key information that is required for the industry, and that's evolved over the years. And as we've seen, embedding new data standards and using the latest technology, within minutes of us creating that data, that could then be passed out to that ecosystem. So, hundreds of data vendors, thousands of clients, and then they're using that to adapt and change. I think one of the things that probably wasn't mentioned is technology. I think speed as well. I think we, like any other provider, our clients are looking for API. How can they get access to that information? So we have clients, I have clients in Europe that are looking for, how quickly can I get this new issuance information? And then I can use it in a standardized way. So, very similar to other providers, but it does allow you to compare different jurisdictions, different markets, using that standardized information.
Very good, thank you. Got another question here about plans for LEI. What's in the pipeline?
Well, obviously we're big, as I mentioned, we are big supporters of the Glyph ANA initiative, where we provide the mapping free of charge available from the Glyph website, where you can download the LEI map to the ISIN. We map hundreds of thousands of identifiers, and actually the interesting thing now is that we are not a local operating unit. We have a partnership with the DTCC to create the ISIN, so there's a huge amount of effort for us to maintain that mapping. However, it's become, I think, for a lot of the NNAs now, the normal course of business. The LEI is now embedded within our standard procedures. And it's becoming, I think that's the difference. Before it was sort of an add-on, but now the LEI is core and fundamental to all of our processes. So that joining up of the data, I think, is the big change, and I think that will improve coverage and data quality.
Absolutely. Do you think the whole no LEI, no trade mantra helped get us to that point?
Well, certainly for European NNAs, who are mostly central securities depositories or exchanges. Those markets, as you know, have to have an LEI. So as you would see, the coverage of LEI in Europe is excellent. The coverage in the US is improving, not necessarily having the full regulatory backup to cover everything, but certainly it is good. And then again, you need that continued rollout, that partnership between the standard, we can create the data, and the regulators in sort of enforcement to use that data. And obviously it takes slightly longer for that to be globally rolled out.
Very good. Last question for you then. I think Scott mentioned, well, he was saying that the participation in the standard setting process is at a low. What are you guys doing to encourage people to get involved?
Well, it's difficult because work on standards can be time consuming, and it can cover into quite a lot of detail, and people are doing that on a voluntary basis. So all of the work that people do, committing many hours to the standards process, is in a sense at the goodwill of their employers. So what I would say to the employers is to say, let those individuals maybe show interest in the standards process, have a bit of time towards that, but it does need a goodwill from employees to enable their staff to join the standards process, and accept that it is a broader value add for the broader good of the industry. And there's a lot of people who have spent their working lives in this standards world, but as they retire, as they move on, as Scott mentioned, it needs to be replaced by fresh blood, fresh individuals. Otherwise, you do end up with a very small group of people making some very fundamental decisions.
Very good. Okay. Well, let's we'll call it a day there. Thank you, Darren. Thanks for sticking around and taking our questions. Always a pleasure. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Andrew.
Great. Okay. We're going to move on now to our next session, which is a panel looking at how to establish a robust data-driven regulatory reporting framework. For this session, which I'm going to moderate, I'm joined by Christina Schack of Vontobel, Sumanda Basu of Societe Generale, Stuart Pitt of Alatus, Simon Cole of Hevera, and Emma Kaliamaki of ANA. So thank you all for joining me today. Thanks for joining us, I should say. I'd just like to re-emphasize to the audience that we are happy to take your questions. So please use the Slido to pose those questions. They'll come to me and I will ask them as appropriate. So let's kick off. Well, actually, let me ask the panelists to very briefly introduce themselves in terms of their involvement in this area of reg reporting. So start off with you, Christina. Welcome.
Hello, thank you, Andrew. Thanks, everyone. My name is Christina Schack. I'm in charge for data operations and strategy at Bank Vontobel. In my role, me and my team, we are building the right data foundation for data governance and data analytics and data reporting. And I'm also involved in the respective data architecture projects. Before I joined Vontobel, I'm already working in the financial industry for about 18 years now, always in charge for asset managers in the respective areas of fund reporting, regulatory reporting, and data management.
Very good, thank you very much. Next up, Sumanda.
Hey, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you, Lorna. Thank you, Andrew, for inviting me for this esteemed panel. I'm Sumanda Basu. I lead data governance and data management technology in Societe Generale for Americas. I have also worked in other global financial organizations for the last 20 years in technology and data management. So in my role, I'm responsible for creating a platform that makes data more accessible, trustworthy, and available. And that could kind of include variety of purposes, including that of regulatory reporting. Thank you.
Very good, and thanks for joining us, Samantha. It's much appreciated. Next up, Stuart of Alatus.
Hi, yeah, I'm Stuart Pitt from Alatus. Myself and co-founder had over 20 years experience working in large financial services organizations, specifically on regulatory reporting projects. And we just saw more and more siloed solutions and lack of reuse of knowledge about the data and the solutions. So we set the company up to build a solution for that, a RegTech solution for that space.
Very good, thanks Stuart, thanks for joining us. Simon Cole, Hevera.
Hi Andrew, it's great to be here. So Simon Cole, CEO of Hevera. And we really exist to help organizations get a grasp of where they sit with their unstructured data primarily against the regulations, giving people a score that lets them measure their efficiency of their data against the regulations and helping them then to solve some of those problems going forward.
Very good, thank you. Finally, Emma Kaliamaki. Emma, it's always good to see you.
And you too. Hi, everyone. So my name's Emma Kaliamaki. I'm the Managing Director of ANA, which is the Association of National Numbering Agencies. ANA's core aim is to foster standardization across the financial services industry through promoting the principles of ISO, and in particular with regards to the standards ISIN, CFI, and FISN. I'm also the Managing Director of the Derivative Service Bureau, which is a subsidiary of ANA, whose specific purpose is to assign ISIN, CFIs, and FISNs for OTC derivatives. And the DSB was also appointed by the Financial Stability Board to be the sole UPI service provider. So that's another standard that will be coming into our suite, expected July next year. So yeah, I'm looking forward to today's chat.
Great, fantastic. Right, before we get started into the panel discussion, we're going to run our first poll of today. We had rather a lot of polls yesterday and they all went very smoothly. So I trust this one will run smoothly as well. So we're going to use Slido first time today, so you know where to go and where to vote. The question is, what do you see as the biggest data management challenge in regulatory reporting? There's a bunch of multiple choice answers there. So you can choose your answers. So please do vote. We will come back in a little while and review the results of that. So I know the panel are looking forward to seeing how you vote on this. So we'll proceed with getting the Q&A going and then come back to that. So I'm going to kick off with the first question. It's going to go to Stuart, and here it is. With regulators taking more proactive approaches to reporting, the expectations for more granular and standardized data, how are financial institutions responding, and what is the impact on data operations and data architectures? Bit of a mouthful, Stuart.
Yep.
I think you get the gist.
Yep. I mean, the first thing I would say is that there's nowhere to hide with granular data. Historically, regulatory reports were all summary, so any issues in your data quality would be evened out over time, and as long as your submissions looked on trend and roughly in line with what the regulator expected, then there probably wasn't much risk of an investigation. Whereas now, by sending them granular data, there's nowhere to hide, and so they have to be much more on point with what they're submitting. So this has driven a lot more cross-validation between different regulatory reports. Historically, they've all developed in silos. Now the banks are having to cross-compare each siloed report to make sure that they're consistent, because the regulators are checking that and picking up on the differences. So to check that, when you're down at granular level, then the regulatory teams have to understand the data lineage from end to end to understand where they're getting the original data from, what transformations it's going through before it ends up in each of their silos. So I think going forward architecturally, firms are going to end up trying to cut out all the intermediate systems that are involved currently in processes to end up with less steps in the data between creation and submission.
Very good. So this is the kind of integrated reporting that we hear about on the street. This has sort of become a holy grail in this particular space.
Yeah.
Very good. Okay, Samanda, how are you seeing? How are you responding? How do you see financial institutions responding to this requirement?
It's a great question. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Stuart, for initiating the conversation on this. From a financial industry perspective, I would really focus on building a data platform agnostic to a specific use case, and that requires understanding what data you have, ensure data gets collected in the right place, that gets stored. We have correct level of data granularity, entitlement, simplify the footprint of data. I think Stuart kind of touched on that. Simplify in the sense, understanding the lineage where the data flows, try to reduce the number of hops if you can, understand what your golden sources are, or system of records, authoritative sources, and ensure the consumption point, try to get the data from golden sources without multiple hops and process and transformation. So I think overall purpose is to simplify your data footprint, simplify your infrastructure, make sure the data is granular, data is available, definitely with a certain level of data access control, entitlement control. But overall, if you can simplify your data footprint and also have your operations team support that, there is we see there is a lot of pressure on the data operations team for this individual ad hoc requirements of the data, for the specific request. We actually try to make this whole regulatory reporting process very complicated. We would rather need to have a both platform-specific approach to simplify things.
Very good, thank you, Samanda. Let's see how these votes have gone now. We should get the results of the poll up. Yep, there they are. I think we're going to ask Simon to have a look at these and see if he is surprised or otherwise any other remarks he might have.
Yeah, I think it was interesting watching the results starting to come in, and what you could see that I think people were struggling to choose which was the hottest topic, because there's so many of them that are challenging. But ultimately, the lack of data standards is something that we are seeing as a bit of a hot topic right now. And in fact, when I look at even at ourselves with our concept of risk scoring. It's ultimately trying to give people that framework and that benchmark that they can build upon, looking across the industry. And certainly, here in the UK, looking at the Bank of England in terms of what they're doing and some of their recent work regarding around, collecting and managing data, the number one key reform that they identified was actually defining and adopting common data standards. So I think we're seeing that, as practitioners, we're frustrated. As regulators, they're driving forward to make that happen. And certainly, for all financial services institutions, that's a really key thing, being able to have that commonality of data standards and access. And when we look, I mean, Stuart touched on it earlier, when we look at interoperability and integration as well, the really key elements, and we can only do that with common data standards that we can work across. So I think, yeah, that is a big one. I think siloed data repositories are also a massive issue as well, but maybe sitting second to that.
A lot of issues around this space. So let's talk, go on to the next question, which talks about some of those. I'll pose it to Christina first. Christina, what are the challenges for firms in providing detailed and standardized reports, and why are they falling short? And a little more specifically, why do firms find it difficult to respond to ad hoc requests from regulators? How can they be more efficient when they do respond?
Yes, thanks, Andrew. I think, yes, one point was already mentioned, and this is really the huge data landscape that companies have to manage, and the different data sources, and getting the overview and keeping the overview of how data can be gathered and put together. I think that is really one of the key elements, that it really takes a lot of time, especially for regulatory reporting, where you have to consolidate data from different business units. You always have to get data from different sources and harmonize that. I think that always takes time. And if companies have not established the proper analytics data platform for that, of course, then it takes time, because each new use case is really a new setup, and you have to dive into the details, understanding where to take the data from, what does it exactly mean. Another point, and I think that relates really much to the poll and the results, and that's also something I have observed, is really each new regulation comes with its own key figures, and it really starts with analyzing what does it exactly mean. Companies very often have data which is close to what is required, but not exactly this definition. So you have to then gather the data again, you have to set up calculations to get these new figures and to report corrective or correct in that way. And yes, again, I think it goes in the same direction. If you have a proper framework and technical setup, it allows you to quickly do that. But the point is that currently companies are just building it up. The situation with data has changed over the last years. Before, we don't have that huge volume of data. And what we also see is that we also need to become more flexible in the reporting. And that is, of course, a huge change of the existing processes that we have. So I think, yes, companies do a lot getting into that direction. As Samantha already mentioned, simplify the whole data landscape, making it more transparent. That would really help to become more sufficient or efficient and more quicker in the response time to such kind of requests.
Very good, thank you, Christina. Let's move on to data quality. I'll throw this one at Emma, and certainly against the backdrop of the poll result, saying there's a lack of data standards. Emma, what are the considerations for ensuring data quality and consistency across the regulatory reporting function, and what are the issues with achieving this?
Well, I think actually it's been touched on by a lot of the panelists already, and I think consideration is really required on a more strategic approach being taken to data management rather than a tactical approach. And by this, I mean looking at the overarching objectives and utilization of data across all the business functions and the downstream outputs that are required. What are the either tools or the integrations that are needed? How is it simplified? How is the how are we adding to this on an ongoing basis to ensure that there's a harmonized approach to how we're handling data more generally, rather than this kind of ad hoc just building as each regime, comes on board. I think we've seen in Europe in particular, and in the UK for the moment, that there is a need for harmonization and consistency of certain reportable data elements. And even from the European Commission, an explicit requirement in asking for ESMA to look at the harmonization across, if we think of MiFID or MiFIR and EMIR refit, SFTR, etc. And so whilst the purposes of these regimes may differ and have different outputs, and as it was mentioned, there could be a nuance to a kind of data element that's required for something else. There is still a need and there are opportunities to look at data alignment and consistency across the different frameworks. Now, I think particular data standards that I'm involved with, to talk with ISIN, CFI, FISN, then you have MIC, country codes, currency codes. You've got messaging tools, business processes with regards to ISO 20022. These are all commonly used across the different regimes. And whilst the standards themselves are beneficial, and they have data elements, or their formats and structure are standardized, you've also got to deal with the interpretation, the application of these standards, and the management of the data. Where is the data coming from in order to achieve that quality and consistency? So you've got some challenges initially, I think, with data coverage. That's something that had been experienced, especially, for example, with the CFI standard. But over time, that has improved considerably. I can say we're in the mid to high 90s on coverage of ISINs to CFI now, which is great. But then you've got that kind of critical mass. And I think LEI is another good example there as to third countries, for example, not having the adequate coverage to be brought through to the European regulatory reporting frameworks, even though they are trying, to push for its broader use and mandate. But then you have, I think, to think of where you're getting your data from, and it's been touched on a couple of times here, to do, golden source or the originating source, a way to maintain data quality. You may be aware that ANA has an initiative with Glyph, where we provide a mapping between ISIN and LEIs in a freely available file. That file today has currently got 5.5 million ISINs mapped across around 82,000 unique LEIs. So there are tools there to take the data from source, but again, you do need to understand, and I think, Stuart mentioned about the transformation and how another aspect is, what is the originating source? Where it's not possible or feasible to have an originating source, you need to understand where your data originates, what process it's been through, what's that transformation, in order to know what is happening with regards to your data quality.
Very good, thank you. And we'll be coming to data lineage in a second. But let me ask if Stuart has any other additions to make to that.
Yeah, so we recently saw an example in a customer data quality where the customer's sector code was central bank, their industrial sector was power generation, and they were actually a hairdresser. And that disappears into the mix in the summary reports, but when you're moving to granular, that's then going to be exposed to the regulator. So fundamentally, a lot of the and that's being adjusted. Where it's being adjusted was within each reporting silo, so they may or may not be adjusting it. So that was inconsistency within one organisation.
Very good. We've actually had a few hairdressers try to apply for our data management awards in the past. So what you tell me doesn't surprise me. I've seen everything in this industry. Let's move on to data lineage as promised. Why is it important and such a challenge to get right? Let me throw that to Samanda. Data lineage. Why is it so difficult?
Thank you, Andrew. I think I spend a lot of my time every day and working on lineage, identifying what is the best process to do, or how to even tackle it. It's become so complex. Let me tell you to everyone that lineage, the way I think, way I see, is a huge mapping of the process and the data and the controls and the applications, right? It's a more of a mapping, understanding where data is coming from, where data is going to, and what are the transformation happen on the way, and what kind of controls do I apply to ensure I get the data the way I want. So it's a living thing, and it keeps on changing. That's actually one of the biggest problem, because data lineage, if you develop, only thing is constant within our companies changes. Our systems changes, our process changes, our regulatory requirement changes. All of these makes the development and maintenance of lineage very complex, number one. Second thing, our data footprint, which I kind of referred previously, is very complex as well. We, even for simple regulatory reports, if you start from the source of the data, it probably have go through 15 different hubs across multiple departments. And think about it, if it goes through, if the data originate from front office, go to the operations, middle office, back office. After that, maybe 2 or 3 different data warehouses get aggregated, get transformed multiple times. Ultimately, it go to the regulatory reporting department. When it get reported, it has crossed the chain of custody, has changed a few times. So if you want to develop a data lineage, you have to really speak to 5 different teams, 7 different applications. And in each of these, probably it has changed the structure, got transformed, because we kind of lack the data standards. I think it came again and again. We lacked a common data standards many times. So each of the department defined their own standards. Each of the department defined their own taxonomy. For example, product hierarchy. If you go to every department, we have a very different product hierarchy, what we have in the front office versus middle office versus in the regulatory reporting, because each of these kind of align with the nearest, nearest partner. Like regulatory reporting product hierarchy is kind of aligned with what the regulators are looking for. So it's our data gets continuously transformed from source to destination. These kind of things make the whole development and maintenance of lineage very, very difficult.
Very good. Thank you, Samanda. Emma, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, only briefly, though. I think Samanda touched on all of the kind of challenges there, but I will say, I just highlight, I think, that when the transformation happens, and it within the organization, you can also be facing, sorry, excuse me, an interpretation issue. And it can be, you're asking yourself, once you've gone down the line, actually, are we still talking about the same thing? And so it's really important to have those controls and for data alignment to be a real fundamental principle on how you're transforming the data and understanding the controls and how it's moving through the organization. Because that interpretation piece of, are we actually talking about the same thing? Different departments using the same piece of data, but for different purposes, and it's meaning something different. It's really important that we have that alignment so those kind of issues don't occur.
Very good. Thank you very much. I'm noticing a few Slido questions coming in. I will try to integrate some of these into the questions we have prepared. So do keep them coming. With that in mind, I'm going to throw this one to Simon. We're going to talk about automation. Simon, how can automation help, and what are the barriers to implementing automation? And just to add in a further twist to that from the audience, we want to move to more automated processes, but not sure where to start. So maybe you could help them out a little bit.
Sure. Well, I think, I mean, it's hard to think of these challenges we're talking about and not see automation as a really fundamental part of the solution. We just got to look at the volume of data we're trying to report against and the breadth of data that we're trying to report against, and realize that actually automation has to be a very key part of it. And I think also, as I kind of mentioned earlier, when we speak to the regulators and get a glimpse of where they're heading, in the UK and the FCA alone, when you look at how they've upskilled their teams, in terms of data scientists, in terms of their capabilities internally around machine learning, AI, and what they expect firms to be reporting to them and how they report, you know, we really need to be ahead of the game on this, because we're going to get overtaken by the regulator in terms of their expectations upon us, and that can be a challenging place to be. Indeed, the recent Bank of England report again, you know, indicated, you know, their desire to work in partnership with organisations in terms of automating, you know, how they report and what they report. So there's a lot of pressure there, and I think there's a lot of benefit as well as part of it. Obviously, I think the barriers. I think there is a perceived lack of automation skills, you know, within the industry, and that's something that needs to be addressed in terms of even from an educational perspective, and that lack of visibility ultimately of the outcomes, which I think a lot has got to do with the lack of standards. It's something that we've hit on a few times here. You know, if everybody is doing their own thing and we're not working off a common set of standards, it means there's an awful lot of needless repetition happening out there. So how can we address those challenges, move the standards up the agenda, and ensure, you know, ensure that we move forward? I think in terms of where do you start, and where does an organization start that wants to automate, but doesn't really know where to. I think, and it plays to what we certainly see in the market, is really understanding your data. If you don't know what you have, if you don't have an assessment and understanding of the capability that you have, you're really going to struggle to step forward. So that audit is really, really important place to start. With that, you can identify, you know, what the regulations are that you're looking to comply with, therefore looking to automate, and then ultimately you can start to build the practices and put the frameworks in place that let you do that. So really getting on top of and getting to grips with your data is the number one aspect you can build on.
Very good, thank you. Christina, how do you see it in terms of automation?
Yes, I think in general, I can confirm what Simon already says. So I think automation is really the key. You can't really avoid it, as the volume of data and the processes are constantly increasing. So you can't really do this manually. And also, if you want to build the data lineage and really visualize it, you use automation tools or AI tools to analyze the data flows. And if you have manual steps in between, this will break the chain in your documentation. Therefore, it's important that you have an automation, because this allows you then to automatically track the data flow, to visualize the data flow, and to analyze the data flow. So therefore, I think automation is key to really analyze the data flow. And actually, for me, this is the first step to optimize it then. So only if you know how your data flows are, this is really data driven. So also the optimization must be done data driven. First of all, you have to understand your data flows, and then you can start to optimize and make it more efficient over time. So this is a constant process as I see it. And I agree with the general comments there. I think automation requires a certain amount of standardization, especially for data. Otherwise, you will not be able to automate. These are really simple things, right? If you can't agree on a format of a field, how will you then automatically process it? You can't. So this is really, and I think that's really good that also the whole industry starts of thinking of stronger standardization of data fields and flows that will really help pushing the automation. I think the challenge is a little bit to keep the balance, because the other aspect is that you have constantly changing things, and this is a little bit contradiction to standardization, because you have a constant flow, constant changing things. And I think this is something which you have to have in mind when doing automation. You have to select tools and techniques, and I think the modern platforms provide this, which allows you to a certain kind of flexibility so that you are able to adapt when new requirements popping up.
Very good, thanks, Christina. We are running out of time, so I'm going to jump around a little bit. We've got a few questions coming in on Slido. I will maybe combine a couple of those. Let me turn to Stuart and ask him what approaches firms can take to move to more granular reporting, and to what extent can cloud, RegTech, and data lakes help? There's a few elements of the Slido coming together here. What can firms do?
Yeah, Well, I mean, fundamentally, the data starts off granular. Everything that's captured is at account level or customer level. It's just historically that's been summarized up. So it should be easier to do granular data. It's there in the source system. It's granular. You can pull out and apply the logic you require and send to the regulator. But you know, the reality is that, as we've talked about, the multiple systems and steps the data goes through. So cloud and data lakes could enable sort of consolidation of the data into one space from which you can do your reporting. And I think sort of RegTech tooling, a lot of RegTech tools focus on AML or KYC. What we're discussing here is really a data management issue more than that has an impact on regulatory reporting. So, you know, just looking at items listed as RegTech tools doesn't necessarily give you the solutions that are out there to solve these problems.
Okay, thank you. Moving on a bit to unstructured data. Throw this one at Simon. Regulators also expect control over unstructured data, which presents significant challenges to compliance teams. How should financial institutions be approaching this?
Yeah, and it's interesting. If you go to the regulator and talk to them about, you know, structured data versus unstructured data, they'll kind of look at you blankly, because as far as they're concerned, it's data, and you know, we have an obligation to look after all of our data and report against it. And the challenges, though, are very, very well understood with unstructured data. You know, it is siloed, it's largely invisible to many people, and it is absolutely full of risk. And it takes a very different approach, a more ingrained approach to get to grips with it, given the challenges that it poses. You know, but by way of an example, when we're working with a typical bank for us, you know, maybe working in 2 or 3 continents, we'll be talking about an unstructured data estate of between 3 and 6 petabytes of data. And to put that into context, we're talking about 10 to 20 billion pieces of information that need to be understood so that we can actually identify what's the value within that. And within that, you know, we typically find about 65% of that information is not valid. It's not information that should be kept and is purely introducing risk within the business. So identifying that, siphoning it out, and then being able to manage the rest of that data, you know, that is a massive challenge, because it's not quite as simple, you know, as going to a data lake and searching up, you know, set criteria. We have to turn that unstructured into a form of structure so we can then report against it alongside everything else we do. So there are massive unique challenges with unstructured data, but thankfully, you know, with the hyperscale of the cloud, we can start on the forensic capability. We can use AI and ML to start breaking into that. We can actually start solving that problem where, you know, 10, 15 years ago, that was impossible. So I think the problem can be solved. It's a different set of tools, but ultimately from the regulatory perspective, we need to manage it and treat it in the exact same way for the same outcomes.
Very good, thank you. On the final question, this one comes from Slido for Samanda. In your view, what does good look like with respect to ways to manage data lineage, and what level of granularity should it be used for?
Oh, thank you. It's a great question. We have actually invested quite a number of years even to figure it out. There are, you know, depends on the need. Various companies are approaching different way. For example, as a business person, I would like to have a business flow, like how, as a business concept or business data, where does it originate? For example, customer. When do we get customer? When do they onboard them? How do the customer information flow through? And variety of things, and what is the reports? We have the customer information that we report somewhere. So as a business person, I would definitely like to have a business concept flow. As a technical person, I would like to have where specific data element like customer ID, my legal entity ID, where do we capture those and how does it flow? And ultimately, these two parallel flow need to kind of map somewhere. And that's why the problem becomes, how do I map my business concepts with my technical specific record, specific field, specific data element in the database? How do we map those things? And how do you continue to map it and maintain the map across how we move along? So there are some technologies that are available which can scan your whole database And there are technologies available which can scan your source code, maybe code written in your ANSI SQL compliant code. I think there are quite a few tools available. There are tools available which can read your Java code or SQL or PL SQL, Java, Python, and they try to understand the process and the data that is embedded inside it. It is not matured yet. It is still going through a lot of changes because software technologies are going through changes themselves. But we have gone at least, maybe 25 to 30% by parsing code and understand how to build the lineage from the code. So it has to be a combination of the automated lineage plus human inputs. Both of them has to exist together to build a complete lineage that becomes sustainable.
Very good. Thank you very much, Samanda.
Thank you.
I'm afraid we have to call it a day there with respect to this topic. I have the feeling that we could talk for much longer around regulatory reporting. So I'm hoping that our panelists and indeed the audience will tune in for our RegTech event that's coming up in, I think in July. I'm sure we'll be revisiting this topic there. So in the meantime, let me thank Christina, Emma, Samanda, Stuart, and Simon for a fantastic panel. Ordinarily would get a round of applause at this point, but being as the situation we're in, I'll just take a thank you from myself. Thanks, guys, appreciate it.
Thank
We'll
you.
move on now to the next session.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Okay, so next session, yeah, I should note actually that we have a webinar on this topic coming up soon, and that the dates for our RegTech Summit Virtual are in fact June 16th and 17th, with a whole day dedicated to regulatory reporting development. So if this is your topic, then you absolutely should be tuning in for that. So it's, let's see, it should be 3 o'clock. It's a bit after 3. I'm running a little bit behind. I can see Lorraine and Ali waiting there. Hi, both. Hope you're well. Thanks for joining.
Very well, thank you.
I've left you with I'm behind schedule, Lorraine. I'm in so next session is going to be our guest Lorraine Waters, who's now Chief Data Officer at Solidatus, will be interviewing Ali Harris, Chief Data Officer at Global Banking Market for Global Banking and Markets at Scotiabank. So we're going to have a very nice chat about how to get customer data right in support of regulatory compliance and, all importantly, a digital customer experience. So just a quick one. Lorraine's just taken over a new position of CDO at Solidatus and is responsible for championing the platform and engaging with Solidatus's community of key stakeholders, including current and future clients, regulators, and strategic partners. And apparently you're going to be taking the lead in convening a new customer advisory board, Lorraine, which that sounds very
indeed.
Excellent. And providing support in the business areas of data privacy, ESG, and financial crime risk management. So lots to do there. It's going to be fantastic. Anyway, I'm going to hand over to you now, Lorraine, and to introduce Ali. Thank you very much, both.
Thanks a lot, Andrew, and I'm delighted to be here today, I have to say, to catch up with everybody and also to chat to Ali, who's the Vice President and Chief Data Officer, as Andrew said, at Global Banking and Markets at Scotiabank. And the topic we're going to talk about today is how to get your customer data right to support regulatory compliance and a digital customer experience. So just before we start, can I remind everybody that they can use Slido, which is probably to the right-hand side of the video, and to give us some questions that I'll try to put to Ali if we have the time, if Andrew has left us with enough time as we go through the discussion. So lovely to see you again, Ali, and perhaps you would give us a a little bit about yourself. And I just also have to say, because you probably won't say it yourself, Ali has recently been recognized as one of CDO Magazine's Global Data Power Women 2021 for championing data and her pioneering work at Scotiabank. So well done. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you. And I was just waiting to leap in because last time you hadn't had your amazing new role, and I'm so excited for you. Thank you so much.
I really appreciate that.
Yeah, it's lovely to see, you know, the geeks inheriting the earth, right? It's so nice to see data being put on a bit of a platform, and I'm so excited about that. So a little bit about me, who I am and my background. So I'd like to say I've been all data all the time through my career, through a number of different verticals, from healthcare to government to banking, and back to banking. And it's been a really amazing road from the origin of my data career that was right at the coalface and the analysis, working in warehouses, you know, the start of data lakes, all the way to the amazing technology that we have now that helps with, you know, our client data. It was patient, now client, and citizen and client, and all of these have, of course, the threads going through them as they relate to either our commercial or our personal entities. So it's been through all of those spaces, data all the time. First, what I do at Scotiabank specifically for GBM is I am the CDO globally. So it's a big portfolio, and we are one of the Canadian banks that has, I think, the largest international presence because we have a very large presence in Latin and South America. So it takes a different lens there as well. So it's really exciting to be able to talk about client data. It's one of my favorite subjects, and all of my favorite standards, which I will get to chat about, I understand, are generally within the client data area.
Perfect. Thank you for that. And so we're here to talk about client data or customer data. So let's talk about what is changing here in terms of the data that you're having to capture around customer information and what's driving this.
Yeah, and there, you know, there's a lot of new legislation, there's not a lot of new regulation, and it will continue to come. So when I think, you know, first of all, there's just on the business side, there's the Customer 360, which I think almost every organization has had a version thereof, right? And that's just, how do we ensure that all of our business lines who are touching the same customers have the same view, that information is not siloed for business purposes? So that's just job one to do, and that's on the business side. And you think that you know, you get to customer aggregation for regulatory reporting, and it becomes even more important. When I think about some of the legislation and regulations that we've already seen, I mean, in MiFIR, under MiFIR MiFID, you need to have an LEI or you can't trade at all. There are certain customer attributes on the retail side that are incredibly important for a bank that's very cross-border, like our Dodd-Frank flags. So, you know, there's another legislation where it's a small piece of data, you know, are you or have you ever been a US citizen? But it's something that we have to capture, and well, we're a few years past our initial scramble, it's still an ongoing cadence. In my shop, you know, we have a large platform that brings our client data together in one place. But the biggest job that we have, it's really not the technical play. It's all of the processes that are creating that data and aligning them. Because again, if you are doing you know, KYC in 3 businesses, say you've got, you know, your global banking and markets, maybe they're in wealth, maybe they're in corporate commercial, you can have a lot of fingers in that particular pie and a lot of systems that are quite siloed. So we do bring them together, but at the same time, from a data governance standpoint, we like to get in. So, you know, the usual, who's running your business processes? What are those processes? Are they in any alignment with any other areas processes? You know, and we're all pretty big organizations, and so sometimes you don't find that. So I would say that's one of the big pieces, and making sure that those data requirements now that are new and nascent from regulation get across all of that. So, the long story short is that, we've got a great platform for aggregation for everything we need to do within client data, but underpinning all that is the governance, process work, identification, and right down to the critical data elements.
And you talked about, the need to capture additional data. And, over the last 10 to 15 years, we talk about LEI, we talk about FATCA. So in terms of additional regulatory requirements, what additional data capture items are you seeing?
Yeah, here's a new one for us, and it kind of, it came U.S. regulation under the Corporate Transparency Act. So they're now looking to track beneficial owners underlying some of our companies, and that's quite new for us. And we've just had something dropped this month in Canada, which said the same thing. So they've done some regulatory consultations, and they're starting to look for how we are going to capture beneficial owners. For most of us on the corporate commercial, wholesale side, we're not necessarily as used to utilizing, personal identifying data within our databases. This may have a big effect on our risk management of our platforms and systems. It may take a different lens around that. We also need to be able to put that data together within these systems. So it's everything from how are we going to do it? What are we going to utilize? And that's still up in the air. In the US, the original Corporate Transparency Act talked a bit about, perhaps Passport. Working as I do, so I'll take off my Scotiabank hat for a moment and I'll put on my ISO hat for a moment. I also I'm head of delegation for Canada for ISO, and I'm the convener of a working group on natural persons identification. So as you know, there is an LEI, dumb number, identifies a company. We're looking at the NPI, dumb number, identifies a person that could be utilized within this. Additionally, I think all sorts of jurisdictions are starting to look at digital identity, often in conjunction with things like digital wallets. And we will have seen, our friends at JP, digital wallet for Bitcoin. That is, again, very, very new. And how are we going to incorporate that? Are banks going to be leaders in the digital identity space? Or are we going to take up things from our jurisdictions? So there is a little bit of, fog of war on where the regulations are going to land. But what we do know is we're going to be able to put these things together in a way we haven't previously. And that's going to actually give an amazing amount of business value if we capture it correctly.
I think you're absolutely right. Certainly in a GBM environment, now that you're having to capture all of this personal data, it does bring along implications around data privacy, data security, that, in an investment banking situation, possibly haven't had to worry about as much as our colleagues in retail. So, we say that, well, collecting beneficial owners and information like that is not really a new thing. Do you perceive any other risk management challenges in capturing that, for example, for screening, sanction screening, for example?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, one thing is that it will be a new lens on sanction screening. It's very different from corporations. There's a lot of third-party reference data folks that we use in the sanction screening AML space. And so that's going to be an increase. I think that there will be definitely an increase in the risk management oversight of those areas as it relates to, beneficial owners or other natural persons. But moreover, just the world is expanding, the connections are expanding, the technology is expanding, and it's not just us. The bad guys are expanding their technology footprint as well. One of the new technologies that, and I say new, but it's not really, we're doing a lot of work with semantic ontologies, right? everything, when you think about risk management, it is a lot about your associations, and the best way to capture that is utilizing a knowledge graph. So, knowledge graph is, I think, the terminology that we are using now, mostly because the very geeky semantic ontology, whoa, can that ever clear a room of executives when you try and bring that? But knowledge graphs, understanding that this connects to this and it might be 3 hops over, is something that we can do now that our traditional columns and rows, warehouses, and the start of the lakes did not provide us. This is giving us, an amazing reach through our data to make those connections that we never had before. Some of those semantic ontologies are based on industry standards. They're all pretty new. And a lot of our data architecture folks, and if there's anyone watching in the data architecture space, I bet you've been burned by an industry model before. And so there's a little bit of hesitancy, but I think we actually are at the right time. I think these industry models have had enough good data people providing input into them that they can be taken up and utilized now. And so we're starting to see that as well. So that's just that standardization is a rising tide that's going to raise all boats.
Yeah, you're right. And I think, the more we use these ontologies, the better they will become, and the cleaner they will become as well. And you mentioned knowledge graphs. Obviously, in my new role, that's very close to my own heart. So I absolutely agree with you there. It's a bit of a game changer, not just for data lineage, but that traceability of data and connections throughout the organization as well. So in terms of leveraging these industry standards that we talked about at Scotiabank, what are the kind of the recent industry advancements that you have seen? Like you mentioned, natural person identifier earlier on. How are you leveraging that?
Well, that's a nascent standard, so we're not leveraging it yet, other than we know about it. And I have to say, back in the day when we were working on the LEI, and I was able to be a part of that, it was grand, because at the very same time, the organization I was working with was opening up their client information facility application. We were able to kind of tuck that in with just-in-time delivery. But I think there's a lot of other standards that are currently either just came out, are in ballot now, will start to be used. Some of those are, so the unique product identifier, the classification of financial instruments, so that's asset classes, it's one up from your ISINs. Organizational roles, which again, when you put that in with beneficial owners and a set of organizational roles, you've got something very powerful. Another standard that has come out, it's out in the wild, is entity legal forms, and that's aligned across the globe. So pardon me, what is an LLC in Canada may be something, called something quite different in France, but we do now have a connector so you can aggregate that sort of information. So I think all of these net new standards are things that we're taking up and utilizing just as quickly as we can. And then there's some of our old favorite standards, thinking of things that, if we're thinking about client data, SIC and NAICS. And my line for a while has been, SIC hasn't been updated since the last Trudeau was in power, but yet we're still using it, which is a very Canadian way to put it. But
we still haven't got it right. Yeah,
we still haven't gotten it right. And now there's about 3 different versions of the NAICS, the North American Industry Code, but we haven't really taken it up. We're still, again, even though we've got standards, now we're mapping our standards to our other standards. So I think that's one where there's a lot of value in having a global industry code to understand, the sectors that we're playing in. And we are taking that up or doing that work because it's not just, it's important for us. So I would say those are the standards that we're starting to leverage. We do use third-party, reference data folks within our shop to help augment, enhance our data. That's also been very powerful, and some of those do bring in these standards. One of the neat things that I've been reviewing and playing with is the legal entity identifier has been mapped to both the ISIN and the BIC codes. So, Often when you're trying to tie things together from your multiple client silos, you only have one identifier in there, and it may not be the one that you have in the others. These sorts of things that are happening in the industry and that the GLIFE is putting out free for the public good are really helpful to accelerate your program and your aggregation.
Well, that is a good tip. And I was around in the early days of LEI as well, and we all know how difficult it was to actually progress it, but it's there now, and should be utilized. But a good tip to look at what third parties are doing around mapping, so you wouldn't have to do that yourself necessarily. And we all know the regulators are pushing around standardization, and
yes.
Are willing to engage in the dialogue around standardization as well, which is good. So in terms of all this standardization, in terms of the improvements therefore that you're able to see and manage your client data better, what do you see are the benefits of that?
Oh, they're so huge, and I've got a long list of them, that I'm looking at. But really, I mean, cross-sell and upsell, right? As much as I'm a data girl, and I think about standards all day, we're a bank, and we have products to sell. And if you have a better view of your client, you know what their next best offer is, what their life situation is. This is on obviously the commercial side for global banking and markets. Certainly on the retail side, we did some amazing innovative work to really understand where our retail customers were, as well as folks are going through COVID over this last year, and ensuring that we kept them straight on their financial journey. And that's just the same in global banking and markets. That ability to pull these things together gave us the opportunity to go to our clients and say, in these unprecedented times, here are the options, because we had a true full view of the client, their share of wallet, where else in the bank they may have been playing, where else in the market they may have been playing. And that's just based on the standardization of data and the aggregation of data that we've already done. So those are, the absolute most powerful. And then you just think about, what else can I do with good data? Regulatory effectiveness has gotten us here, and I'm very excited about that, but it doesn't give you the full journey, and it does not help with your executives. So that's back to, enhancing customer experience and business objectives. But then you also have just overall optimizing effectiveness, right? So I think if you can lower your process cost by straight through processing, utilizing, good identifiers, if you can't make money, and we're all a cost center, you best not be spending it foolishly. And so there's a lot of effectiveness and optimization of processes and systems that can be done through standardization that will then help the overall view of the client, and your front office sellers.
I think that's a really great answer, and a really good lesson to all of us. The answers you gave were, first of all, cross-sell, upsell. So always have the business outcome as your first, the positive business outcome as your first answer. You briefly mentioned the regulatory compliance aspect, and then you talked about, the other benefits to the business as well. So I think we all should take a lesson from that. Briefly mentioned the compliance aspect, focus much more on the business outcomes when we talk about the benefits. So
the other thing I'd like to suggest, Lorraine, and just on the regulatory, and thank you for pointing that out, because I think as professionals, we've had a pretty good run with the post 2008 regulations around data, and as data professionals, that's really allowed us to advance the data agenda. But it's always got to come back to that business value. So one of the things, as a tip, but something that's been very valuable for me is, as we have these regulatory programs and initiatives, and the healthcare background, while the patient is on the table or the source system is open, I like to do the yes and instead of the yes but. Yes, but we can't do that because we've got to focus on regulatory. Yes, and while we're in there, let's see what else we can do for business value. When you've got a process that you're aligning, can you enhance the data within this process as opposed to just remediate it for regulatory?
Absolutely. And I have to get to a couple of the questions before we close off. And the most popular question at the moment is, are you expecting additional privacy regulations to impact on your data operations?
Absolutely. So, and I'll give you a front run. So there's currently consultations on cross-border data flows. So I know we're going to have a massive effect for all of us. There is new privacy legislation that is coming down in Canada. I've been saying it's probably, reading the tea leaves, it's likely to be closer to Cali than GDPR, so a little bit of GDPR light. And then, recent events with Apple, and their new privacy options. The big one, it's always been a bit of a bugbear for me that in the privacy world, your device ID is not considered personal information, despite the fact it's a pretty good unique identifier for us. They know where I am and when I've been to Tim Hortons. Taking that away from a lot of the organizations who use that for that type of marketing, it's going to have a massive effect. I think that's primarily on the personal and retail side, but there will be a trickle down.
Absolutely. And the next question is, how do you get the organizational buy-in to address these types of data challenges? I'm assuming it's by talking about business benefits, business outcomes, and cost savings in advance of regulatory.
Bringing Timbits to the table, usually helps, but it's harder when you're working remotely. No, that's exactly it. It is bringing the business value first, having the conversation. One of the things that I did at an organization previously is they had a bit of a newsletter where they talked about people's roles. Every role, I looked for someone who had data in it and went and asked their pain points. And then had a long list of things that then I could immediately solve or work with them as we were building their governance. That's been really fantastic. When you go to someone with a data management and data governance lens, you're usually asking them to do work. Mm-hmm. So you best come with some benefits in your back pocket at the same time. And yeah, donuts are also pretty good.
Yeah, that's excellent. And very final question then, in terms of technology, what technologies are you using at the moment to assist you, and what's giving you the biggest gains?
I'm gonna pepper folks with acronyms now. So OCR, optical character recognition, with a side of NLP, natural language processing, and RPA, robotics process automation. Those three, by those powers combined, you can take a doc, scan it, discreetly pull out the data, and you can do that actually using RPA, which is great. So things that used to be, you would have, a million folks looking at things and then typing the swivel chair is gone. Big gains in mastering client data using machine learning and AI. That's certainly something that we're doing in our master data management space. Metadata ingestion. So as we're doing metadata and those semantic ontologies, the ability to utilize that for both ingestion, data placement, and consumption means that a lot of your traditional mapping and modeling can be accelerated. And ML's on the continuum to AI. So as we get better machine learning, it then can start to inform some of our more true AI models.
That's absolutely brilliant. And you've given us lots and lots of tips and hints there, Ali. So much appreciated for that. I think we're out of time, unfortunately. I could talk to you all night.
Thank you so much.
But Andrew, I'm going to hand back to you, if that's okay.
Both Ali and Lorraine. I was just stepping in for a moment here, so thank you. A very, very interesting conversation about getting your customer onboarding right. It's still a long way to go, a lot to do, but that was some super guidance. Thank you very, very much indeed.
Thanks,
So
Sarah.
let's take a quick break and look at a BVD short clip.
Pathfinder can show you if company A is linked to company B or to a group of companies. And it's the ideal tool for conflict checking or onboarding fast. You can use it to check whether a company you want to work with is linked to your existing clients, or if a company you're interested in is linked to any watch lists you're monitoring. And you can flex your terms and how strict you are about links. At Bureau van Dijk, we're in the business of certainty. We're here to help you improve efficiency, mitigate risk, grow revenue. Leave the data work to us. Contact us to find out more about our free trial scheme.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that. Nice to see BVD at our Data Management Summit indeed. And next, it is my pleasure to welcome Ted Data. Ted is a member, as it were. He works for BVD. He has a great background in this area. He has worked on all sorts of projects along these lines. Ted, today, what are you going to tell us about today? I think it's going to be, how does data management help with beneficial ownership due diligence? And beneficial ownership has become such a big thing when we started just with the sort of legal entity and climbed up to beneficial ownership. As I said, Ted Data is a director of Bureau van Dijk's Compliance Solutions business with responsibility for the UK, Nordic, Middle East and Africa region. He spent the last decade helping organizations harness data and technology to improve their risk-based approach to customer and third-party due diligence. Ted is a regular contributor to Europe's leading anti-corruption forums and an active supporter of public-private collaborative initiatives. And he was a member of the winning team at the FCA's 2019 Global AML and Financial Crime Tech Sprint, which addressed beneficial ownership registry and reconciliation for the benefit of all market participants. So I suspect there's not much about UBO that Ted doesn't know. So Ted, let me hand over to you for your presentation.
Thank you, Sarah. That's a very kind introduction. Yeah, let me just let me share my screen. That's probably a good place to start, isn't it? Bring that up for everybody. So I believe we have 10 minutes, correct?
Yep, that's right.
Just of the panel as well, which I'm with you for on that. So yeah, we're going to just take a whistle-stop tour. The title's fairly clear. How can we use data management strategies to help beneficial ownership due diligence? So it's going to be setting the scene around the regulatory environment, just a high level of the context. And we're going to talk a little bit about the challenges that are unsurprisingly data oriented in this context, and give you a view of some solutions. So try and be positive. It's a challenging area. We'll save that for the panel when we get into the critical side of it. But what are we seeing in the market? What are people doing? What regulatory initiatives are out there? And share some of that with you over the next 10 minutes or so. So the best way of describing the framework globally is patchwork at best. I think I was just reading an article on Tax Justice Network. There are about 80 countries that have some form of established beneficial ownership regulatory regime, whether it's a very light touch reporting right through to more mature. And we'll talk about those in a second. In those three cases on the right, the left-hand side of this screen has some quotes from what you probably all remember. It was fairly recent, actually. It feels like it's old news. The FinCEN files in September last year. You can think of this probably as a recurring theme. I mean, way back in 2017-16 with the Panama Papers, I recall coming into work and thinking things were never going to be the same again. How little did I know, but clearly slightly different. You know, we know the differences between facilitation and sort of SARS reporting ultimately, but either way, I've highlighted some of the ICIJ's comments. Half of the reports confirmed or contained banks not understanding or knowing who was behind the entities behind transactions, companies registered in secrecy jurisdictions. What can we do about that? Not knowing the ultimate owner, and an interesting one which probably links up to the first point there, $4.5 billion flowing through LLPs in Companies House. So that's just a couple of excerpts that relate to the challenges in this space. On the legislative framework then, the UK, we had positive announcements 2 years ago. I think BEIS have invested something in like £12 million for a 3-year and now 5-year reform program. It's ambitious, effectively trying to move Companies House beyond its role today as a gatekeeper to one which takes on a verification of the data and takes up much more of a law enforcement consideration. That's part of their 3rd stage, and you can read their report online, but ultimately trying to verify the data and not just be a repository. So a big step change in how they go about that. I believe that's probably, that first phase is to conclude this year. So keep tuned on that. Europe, I was on a FATF call with the European Commission. So of course, 5MLD, in the background, that itself is still a patchwork. There are a number of countries that don't have a register. The challenge there is about legitimate interest and openness. So it's all well and good having one, but 5MLD dictates that that's open, not just reserved for law enforcement. The European Commission, I know, is ambitious and moving forward. Boris, I don't know if there's anything behind the acronym. It stands for Beneficial Ownership Registry and Connected Systems. So it's about linking the registers, and there's projects underway. Have been testing that, again, using data primarily for law enforcement. But the connectivity is clearly really important, and we'll come to that a little bit later. And then some more green shoots from the US. This year, January, the Corporate Transparency Act, or National Defense Act, but the first commitment to a self-reporting regime for US companies. Again, it will probably be about 18 months before we start to see the first data. Again, I was reading about the 24 reporting exemptions that exist. So good and an amazing thing to have, obviously, to move forward with the US. But you can see different stages of maturity, but certainly still a patchwork, and that creates challenges for people. So what are some of those challenges related to data? So data, the challenges I would break down in 2 categories. We have a range of challenges that pertain to basically the availability and quality and reliability of source content. I've spoken there before about disclosure standards, how varied they are and inconsistent. The reliability of the core data. So it's, again, having that content, but how much do you rely on the content? Is the content verified? When was it last verified? Those kind of processes that I'm sure from a data management perspective are bedded into many people's systems. We're dealing with public registers are much more of a challenge. And culturally, transparency is something which, the reason why only 80 countries have something at least governing a kind of framework, because cultural transparency presents a big blocker. Operationally, more recent, this is giving us a kind of last 12 months where we're all remote view. COVID's created 2 things: increasing digitization and automation, and customer not present transactions massively increased. The expectations of customers have aligned to that, to be able to do that. And the FCA wrote the CEO letter this year about digital onboarding, KYC. At the same time, we've got analyst motivation. So the issues of being able to quickly and accurately look at red flags and spot them with an increased volume of transactions going through can create concern and certainly create some challenge. And a case study that on the registers, just while I'm with my Companies House hat on, we pulled this out a couple of years ago, but it's certainly still valid. So with registers, a couple of things that create challenges. Firstly, self-reported information. So this is an example from a company called Brando Eyewear. The left-hand side is what the PSC register represents and tells us the company is owned and controlled by. The right-hand side diagram is from our Orbis database that some of you may be familiar with, but you can see Mondetica as the PSC. Mondetica Limited is a company, not a person. The essence of the regulation is that you have people of significant control, natural persons. There are some legal person exemptions. But then beyond Mondetica, there is a holding company in Hong Kong. And beyond the holding company in Hong Kong, there is an individual, Michael Jardine, who's a Canadian national. So that cross-border piece. Interestingly, if you click through Companies House, multiple links, you do get there. So a lot of that is just about data quality as well, and just being able to automate that. So solutions, conscious that we've got a couple of minutes. So high level, what's happening in the market around solutions from a sort of governance and regulatory perspective, and also some practical tips. if you missed this, it's worth having a look through the highlights here. The FATF white paper or best practice paper on beneficial ownership from 2019 talks about a multi-pronged approach. And we'll get into this, I think, on the panel in terms of what do you actually need to make this happen. So what the fundamental building blocks of being able to triangulate data. They've called out quite rightly sort of 3 central pillars. There is the existing information approach to talk about. So what do you have within the institution? What commercial databases are you accessing? There is self-registering from the companies, so companies themselves filing, and there is obliged entities themselves. So the market participants and all those are involved in the sprint that was referenced in my introduction. But essentially being able to pull together, validate, resolve entity data across multiple sets, whether you're using a third party who's bedded into doing that with their model or internally with your own data. That foundational approach is a journey for many people, and we've seen some examples of large organizations doing that. I can talk more to that in the panel. And once you're there with the foundation, then you can start to get clever. So it's all about prioritization when thinking about due diligence. This is Michele Riccardi. He works for, well, he's a senior researcher at the University of Milan, but he's also founder of Transcrime. Transcrime, we partner with Transcrime are now funding, have had a project funded again by the European Commission. Essentially, the idea is that complexity itself is a red flag. If you're onboarding millions of individuals or thousands of legal entities, complexity itself pertains to risk. Is there a legitimate reason commercially why a company is structured how it is, or does its structure itself merit further investigation? So he's built a data model that looks at that. There's some evidence from research a couple of years back that companies that are more complex are more likely to be hiding enforcement activity and sanctions. So can you, with your foundations in place, start to run modeling to help your analysts prioritize? Power and control alongside that. This is where we have been innovating ourselves in the last couple of years. Beneficial ownership, to take it back to principle, you've got share equity, you've got control, hence the register of persons of significant control. Control is a hard thing to do with data. How do you evidence control without having to understand subjective content? What we've been doing is building a model ourselves. So let's take a case here. This is Mark Hargreaves. Mark Hargreaves has 18% or 19%, 18.98 to be accurate, of this legal entity here called Crown Talent and Media Group. The rest of the shareholders have, of which there are over 99, have a maximum of 4%, an average of about 0.2%. We've been looking at that. A partner of ours has been working with us on this, and we built a model that looks at the influence and control Mark has over the company because of voting rights. So we're using the IFRS guidance here around disbursement, which you can read. But effectively, we calculate that in 96.9% of occasions, Mark can have control. So bringing that level of analytics on top of the foundational data to look at that power and control is a really interesting area. And finally, when you've got all that, you can layer on smart technologies. So there's a lot of smart technologies in the market, and we'll be hearing, I know, from others. I'm sure you've had others talk with you over the last day or so. But where many people struggle is to do this bit first and think that technology is going to solve all the problems. That's actually going to amplify the issue and make it worse. So what we need to understand is what's being fed into the model, whether it's technology, what's driving that. We think of a framework that brings in KYC and due diligence into the same environment. So the know your customer identification, validation on the left, and then the screening and risk assessment on the right. But yes, there's huge amounts of promise with AI machine learning, but machines need to be taught, and the teaching has to come through the data and then the analysts themselves. So we see analysts now feeding back loops, driving models, rather than simply being a recipient of information. And that again is certainly compliance 2.0. And I think that's it I had from me. I'm trying to keep into time or so. So I don't know if you have any questions that have come through there, Sarah, or we're moving into the panel. Thank you.
Sarah, you're on mute.
I'm back. Excellent. Thank you, Andrew. So, Ted, this is a long question, as you probably gathered. It says, capturing beneficial ownership data and personal data poses challenges around managing privacy and security for PII information. How do you recommend FIs approach this, as legacy systems and databases are not designed to do this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there are general data protection exemptions for this kind of activity. So I'm not a data protection lawyer, so I wouldn't want to give people further. But for capturing PII in the context of KYC and AML, then there's general carve-outs for that. But clearly, obviously, you need to consult your own policy. A lot of the data is public in the end. So whether it's information on commercial databases, whether it's information at Companies House, whether it's information from news sources, then it's itself public. But yeah, it is a challenge. I think at the core of where the TechSprint future state is around that privacy enhancing technology. So the big opportunity in the market is for data sharing at scale from obliged entities, and clearly the barriers to that are privacy. So thinking about homomorphic encryption, thinking about layering on technology was part of what we used in our proof of concept. So it's it's a big topic, but I would say consult your own policy on that. But yeah, I hope that gives a guidance.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Ted. Let's leave it there. And if, Ted, you'd like to put your panel hat on, let me say a big thank you to Ted and welcome to our next session on KYC and onboarding, best practice data management, support digitization, real-time compliance, and an improved customer experience. Of course, my name is Sarah Underwood. I'm an editor here at A-Team Group, and I'll moderate this section. Let me ask our speakers to introduce themselves. They're just coming online now. Lovely. And I do believe we're all here. So coming to you first, Eric, please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Eric Morgan. I've been involved in the KYC space for about the last 22 years, so quite a while. Worked at a number of leading financial institutions, and I'm happy to join in the discussion.
Thanks. Cho, coming to you. Good to see you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Cho Tay, run the client lifecycle management team here at Investec, covering the new business onboarding, AML review, offboarding, and a change function. My focus is in this session is how can we be better, be automated or more robust in the onboarding space to facilitate business growth.
Excellent. Ted, you've only just left our screens, but in case anybody has just turned on their screen.
I didn't actually introduce myself either on that call. I just flew straight in, so I may as well. So yeah, Ted Tatter. I lead our EMEA KYC practice group at Bureau van Dijk, and we're a Moody's Analytics company.
Thank you very much. Aaron, coming back to you.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Good to meet everybody. I'm our head of KYC solutions here at Quantexa. So at Quantexa, I lead our KYC and due diligence focused technology solutions. My career before Quantexa was very much focused on financial crime technology advisory and complex KYC challenges, kind of ranging from remediation to onboarding to automation. So very happy to be here today.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you to all of you for coming to join us today. Let's kick off this session with a poll question, if we may. The question asks, what is your biggest data management challenge in moving to digitized and automated processes for KYC and onboarding? And while you select your options, if I may, I'll going to come to Cho. And Cho, over the last year, we've seen an acceleration in the digitization and automation of the KYC and onboarding processes in for FIs. From a holistic perspective, what has this meant and how data is management in terms of the challenges and how folks are managing with this?
Thanks, Sarah. So this is definitely a good sign from my perspective. I would like to think that to achieve automation and digitalization, it is actually a collective effort from all parties. So like clients, registries, such as company houses and around the world, data providers, solutions provider, counterparts like us, bank or organizations need to help to use this and organize this data in a standardized ways. And the best examples to refer to this is the adoption of
Oh, sure, we lost you. Are you back? Carry on. Yep.
Which part did I?
Just a couple of seconds, we lost you.
Yeah, so I just think that the best example is the adoption of LEI. So once we collectively agreed and acknowledge that's the way forward, then we can begin the journey of digitization. So obviously I've indicated this in the industry best practice, but I believe that this approach is similar to within the organization as well.
Thank you very much indeed. Eric, what would you add there?
Yeah, I think those are really good points. I think the other issue is we tend to get data collectively. When I say we get data, and we try to own sometimes that data just because we've touched it or we've put it into our systems. And I think we need to be careful with that conceptually. I think there are a lot of potential hazards in that space, and we obviously we have data protection and other things we have to be very cognizant of, but we also have data ownership. And I think leveraging other areas and systems is paramount to consistency and a quicker adoption, but we just need to be a little cautious on how we approach that. We can't go all in, as I've seen some organizations try to do, because we end up potentially shooting ourselves in the foot.
Okay, let's take a vendor perspective on this as we've sped through.
It's not necessarily, I don't mean to take a vendor perspective. I think organizations, we all have a similar approach. As soon as it comes through the front door, we tend to think of it as ours. And that's very good from an ownership standpoint to take responsibility for managing and maintaining the data. But we just need to be careful.
Okay, no, we'll come to vendors now and see what they say, how things are changing and how their work has changed with clients. So Aaron, would you like to start?
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that's a very interesting point by Eric, because one of the things that we've really seen our clients focused on over the last year is trying to get more and better use out of the data that they actually have internally, right? And when we think about digitization and automation in KYC, from a vendor point of view, what we're trying to do is help financial institutions to connect the data that they already have, so their customer data across different silos and lines of business, and also look at the really vast amount of external data out there that can also help with KYC digitization. So from a customer perspective and from a vendor perspective, I'd say our clients really are focused on trying to harness and squeeze as much as they can out of the data that they have today, obviously subject to some of the challenges that Eric was mentioning.
Excellent. Ted, what would you add there?
Aaron's done a great job. That's perfect from a vendor perspective. I would add that in the last 12 months, you've seen a lot of winners and losers in terms of business models. And we've seen some emerging new business models that we weren't working with. We didn't have customer bases. So I think it's put a lot of pressure on some of those models that suddenly where cross-border payments and areas where data flow has increased a lot. The demand for projects that were kind of shelved have suddenly come back round. So that's been interesting. The challenge operationally on trying to deliver that at the moment for many people, I think is, it is itself a challenge. But I think that getting more from what you've got and then thinking about some of those procurement projects that have been dusted off, that we thought this RFP was never coming back round and suddenly it's back round. So that's an interesting place to be.
Okay, that's great. Let's see what our audience is thinking. Could we see the poll results? Look, it's our old favorite, poor data quality. Ted, what would you like to say about that poll? Is that what you would expect people say were their biggest problems?
Yeah, I think I would probably have gone for data silos, but maybe it's because they're at the top. It's at the top, so I just like to vote simply. But I think so. I think it's linking that to number 5, because the problem I find is that data quality in isolation doesn't sell, right? You're not, if you're trying to sell transformation and you think, well, data quality, how do I get budget and buy-in from senior management? So the building blocks of what the output is, what's the return on investment, why are we doing something? I think those two things are interrelated, and perhaps the fact that that's only 10% shows why the top one's still 37%.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much indeed. And let's move on and coming back to you, Aaron. Those were the issues that our audience sees. How can you begin to address these kinds of challenges and problems?
Yeah, I mean, those challenges are all, I think, very well shared amongst our client base. And I would particularly look at data silos and legacy systems, right, as a key problem when you look at automation and digitization of KYC. The way that we really approach it is by trying to create what we call a single entity view. And this is something, of course, that vendors and systems have talked about for ages, a single customer view, 360-degree view of customer to rule them all. But really, the data and the technology does exist more than ever today to be able to create that and break down some of the data silos that you have internally, while also using external data, which is a really key ingredient. Sometimes there's this concept of data quantity over data quality. I might not have the full data quality that I want internally to know everything about my customer, but I can actually go out to corporate registries, beneficial ownership data sources, other external data sources to try to bring that together into a single view and get around some of those data quality issues that have always been there.
Thank you. Sure, how do you address these kinds of challenges at Investec?
Yeah, I will try to put a balance to it from the bank perspective. So following on from the polls, I see internet connection unstable. So let me know if you can't hear me. So normally when I get asked these questions, I tend to jump straight to the solutions. But I think it's good to make a caveat here to highlight that everyone has their own approach, that everyone has their own problems, and they should choose the better solutions that fit their organizers and the bank context. So in my space, in my context, so the rule of thumb is garbage in, garbage out. So everyone's agreed that. So therefore, the first thing is to have a fairly good understanding of the data flow, end to end. So I think this is touched on in some of the previous speakers in this session as well. We're going to really understand the flow. And then there are many tools or techniques available to assist this. Then onboarding or KYC automation starts with a really hands-on remediation, or what I call data normalizations. It involves standardizing the naming convention, redefining the processes for the flow end-to-end, needs to include the businesses, the onboarding team, financial crime team, credit, legal, operation, and finally the reporting team, and the hands-off between these teams so that you can take quite a holistic view when you're designing the flow. Then if you're solving that problems, you need to have a definition how you're going to solve it, or if you don't, at least you need to have a plan and a frame and a time frame when you're going to solve this. Now, once all this is laid out, technology can come in and really maximize their benefit to automate. That's just my perspective.
That's great, Joel. Thank you very much indeed. And let's drill into this endless problem of data quality, which maybe we can end soon. Coming to you, Ted, looking specifically at data quality, how are firms improving this to improve KYC and onboarding, and how are they setting standards and controls to ensuring consistent data? I know this is a very difficult thing for a lot of firms. What would you recommend here?
It is, and I'll just go back to Joel's model. What we're seeing is that businesses are realizing that they have internal an opportunity to reorganize, and I think of some of our clients that are this and some close to home, but you have internal, almost like foundational units within your business, and they serve internal customers, and they might serve external customers too, but clearly data as a foundational building block in many organizations. So we're seeing that internal foundation is being put in place, and then the layer above that is a range of use case structures. So whether the use case is KYC, whether it's screening, whether it's loan origination, whether it's credit. So the foundational operating unit can supply the use case layer and internally have that connectivity. Effectively, the more eyes on the data, right? So you can solve this with technical problems, and you can solve it with thinking about, right, we're all invested in our internal data asset, and the more investment we have in the asset, the more we can then drive the use cases. So yeah, that kind of change program is something that's interesting for us at the moment, and I think it might resonate with some people out there. Clearly, there's lots of techniques, and Joel's spoken to those, but just from a kind of governance, operating, and just program management, we're seeing some interesting results with a new way of doing things.
Okay, Eric, what would you add there on data quality? I know it's a subject close to your heart.
Yeah, it is, unfortunately, and that's a sad thing to have to admit and acknowledge. One thing I'd like to say that often we talk about data quality, and it's not necessarily understood as data. Well, we understand it as data quality, but objectively, that's not the case. It's the use of the data. So there may be instances where they've used an acronym or a short name, And that would be viewed as an inconsistent use of that data, but maybe for trading, it's a perfectly applicable and viable use. And it's actually a better use than the full legal name, as an example, a ticker symbol as an example. And the problem we have is the linking of those disparate elements of data and making sure that all of those elements are comprised or housed in the single view. And that's often what's missing. We often have 16 different views of the same customer, most of which are valid, some of which may be, a complete mess, but most of them, by the number of remediations and updates that have happened, are in pretty good order. It's just the use of the data isn't fully understood. And we tend to go in thinking that because we use the data for purpose X, KYC or due diligence, that everyone is using the data for the same purpose. And then we tend to overwrite their data to what we think it should be. And that gets into an internal view of the data that becomes very inconsistent and misunderstood. And I hear what Cor says, I would almost reverse a little bit of what he said and think that the basics, the taxonomy, the rule book, the understanding of the data needs to be laid down first. And then you can start to construct a pyramid of how you're going to view or use that data. Often companies and organizations have differing views. Someone thinks the data is not clean or isn't correct, but it is for the use. They just didn't understand the use.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And before we go on, I have an audience question. I'm going to put it to you, Chor, if I may. And it asks, we want to upgrade our KYC program, but face resistance from the business on further investment. What are the key things of a robust KYC solution? And do you have any tips on justifying the value of investing in KYC?
There's a very good question there. So I would answer it this way. So I think you have to carry your stakeholders into the journey, and that's the hard thing to do. And you almost have to go down the typical project management route. What is the low-hanging fruit to show that what you contribute is what you meant, and what you said is what you actually will deliver. So you have to almost gain that trust, and then once you do it, you have to then maximize it by constantly communicating back to the stakeholders, say, this is what I've done, this is what I created for you. So you almost have to build a continuous business case. It is unfortunately not a one-off job. You have to continue, go back, revisit this and get them on a journey. And then you may have to start off with one or a few selected business and then look to expand that further. Again, it may not apply to everyone, but it may apply to some of you.
Okay, and what key things should people be looking for in a KYC solution? Are they looking for complete solutions or best of breed solutions?
I think there is also a definition. So what does onboarding mean in your company, and what does KYC mean in your company? So it's quite difficult to give a generic answer, but some onboarding has other elements such as regulatory, tax. All of us are like, it's just quite a different. I still think that you have to really understand the flow of the data, that you really understand your client data and how it would be used by those teams that I kind of like mentioned, the business supporting team or business enablement team. And then you pick the tool that is closest to what you understand. You have to probably test it out before you put it and then see if it works.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for that. And I have a question actually for you, Ted, if I may ask you. This one is about the LEI, which is something I'm sure you're very familiar with. And it says, the Global LEI Foundation proposes including the LEI on onboarding through the process of validation agents, which is quite a new scheme from late last year. Does the panel think this would work and be useful in speeding up onboarding and fighting financial crime?
Yeah, I think it's got a role to play, 100%. I think that I guess the challenge to that is, if you look at 400 million companies that we manage information on, the LEI becomes, I wouldn't say a drop in the water, but the scale of it versus the scale of the commercial world, there's a disconnect. Now, obviously, to scale that up, and that's where that's a huge gap, right? I mean, I haven't got the latest stats on how many LEI entities exist out there, but it's not more than 10 million, maybe under 5. So I don't want to yeah, just from that perspective, it has a role to play, and any standardization is really good. Certainly, will LEIs help with beneficial ownership? No, it might help with entity data validation, but the linkage and complexity of that is another level. So yeah, that's kind of my slightly realist view of it. But yeah, that's how we kind of I'm viewing it at the moment.
No, I think that's fair enough. I think there are about 7 million or issued at the moment, something like that. So yeah, way to go, but a good start anyway, for sure. Good. Eric, can I come back to you with our questions and tell us a little bit about the benefits that can be gained from automation and digitalization of KYC practices, and what's the difference there? Digitalization, automation?
Yeah, I think a lot of the benefits are probably intuitively known by the individuals working in the areas. There's efficiency. There's obviously a better understanding of the customer. I think one of the big benefits that we often forget is you can build in quite easily, once you standardize and understand your customers and the data, your risk model in the organization. Now, that doesn't necessarily need to be automated. Ideally, it would be. But what you can do is set rules and guidelines that will allow the organization to much more closely manage their customer base. And that's very, very important, because often we get so caught up in the minutia of the data and the KYC and the LEIs, et cetera, that we forget that the reason that's there, beyond the huge staggering fines that can come into play, is to manage the risk portfolio in the organization, and that gets lost. And I think if we understand our data and understand our customers, that allows us to come back to that much more easily and much better. I think to the last question, LEI is definitely a key component and very good. However, as everyone was agreeing, it's not the silver bullet. It's just one element that will get us there. And it's good, but it has unfortunately a long way to go.
Okay, thank you. Aaron, coming over to you to talk a little bit more about the benefits that you can gain from automation and digitization.
Yeah, sure, Sarah. And to the question that you asked around what's the difference between those, in my view, when I talk about automation, what I'm really doing is looking at the KYC process that I have today and seeing how I can take out the manual steps and the manual work from that, right? How can I make the process flow in a more automated way end to end? Whereas when we talk to customers about digitization, that's really rethinking the process to be digital first, right? So why do I need to ask the customer for physical documents when I could do a selfie and a picture of a passport, for example? Or why am I asking the customer for beneficial ownership details that I could obtain from a registry that's available? So those types of things I find to be more in the digitization than the automation piece. I think from a benefits point of view, Eric actually summarized it very well. When I usually talk about this, I could talk about the triangle of cost, customer, and control, right? Those are the three things we're essentially trying to balance in whatever KYC process we put into place. And when you automate and digitize, you can actually affect all three of those levers. We talk about cost and control a lot, right? Trying to reduce the amount that we have to spend on staff and on manual processes, checking documents. There's also, as Eric mentioned, a control benefit. The whole point is to understand the risk that your customers bring and focus your staff on the customers at the top of that risk pyramid. And I think the third piece that often gets left off is that effective digitization of the KYC process improves your customers' experience with you and improves their outcomes. I think we often see KYC as a compliance cost. It's something we have to do to get ahead. But really, I see KYC as a potential competitive differentiator, right? Banks and FIs that do KYC better have happier customers, have better retention, and have a more smooth onboarding flow for those. So I think that you can really see it in that regard.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. And let's move on again. And let me come back to you, Ted, if I may. Can you describe a successful implementation where automation and indeed digitization has added value to a KYC and onboarding program?
Yeah, I'm less close as I'd like to be these days of implementation, Sarah, but I would be able to talk about a couple. And I just want to echo what Aaron said. I think that the three stakeholders, when these programs work well, the business, the operations team, and compliance and legal are all happy, but they're very different stakeholders. So they've all got different needs, whether business is about bringing customers quicker, making more money, operations, efficiency, saving time, headcount, and compliance, taking risk out of the program. and that balance is not always harmonious. So that kind of, for anyone working internally or externally, always think about that. For us, yeah, we worked with one of the organizations that were funding the bounce back loans, and their applications went quite high. They have a use of their API. So fairly simply, for those, connecting to an API to pre-populate a web form, allow customer sign-ups. It's very simple for a challenger bank to do that. I think more clunky and complex for large organizations, but without that, they wouldn't have been able to scale as rapidly as they might. At the other end of the spectrum, large tier one bank putting in a KYC rules engine across their business. So being able to standardize that in 30 jurisdictions, that's the end of a 2-year project. So that's kind of the scale that you think different between a small organization and a large. So a couple of things that we've worked on in the last couple of years.
Excellent, thank you. Chor, would you like to describe a successful implementation? It may be your very own.
Yeah, I certainly will share some experience, but to build on for what Ted just laid the foundation there, I think it's very crucial that to get to the implementation, you really need to leverage on API to be fast, to be accurate, and your digitization on risk assessment. So the examples that I'm gonna touch on is some of the audience might actually have already heard it from me, but I still think that this is quite a worthwhile example to share. So in the onboarding automation in Investec, so we have made the same day onboarding very possible. Some in a couple of hours, some in a couple of minutes. So across the 3 major categories, the trading, the deposits, the lending, across various client types. So that's gone live. So we perform our risk assessment digitally without dual keying. We screen most of our client under 1 click, no copy and paste. We produce a real-time report knowing exactly who onboarded which client for which product, which desk. And finally, we'll also offer a self-service onboarding capability to some of our corporate clients. So we're definitely not finished. There's still much more to do, but what we have achieved is what I call in the onboarding automation has fantastic outcome and a very eye-watering ROI.
That's very good to hear. Aaron, what would you say?
That is certainly great to hear, and I would agree. I mean, the ROI on some of these implementations can be very compelling. One of the implementations that we've done recently is at a tier 1 UK bank, and thinking a little bit beyond the onboarding use case, what they were looking at is changing the way that they do ongoing KYC into a continuous or event-driven process. So instead of trying to do periodic due diligence every 1, 3, or 5 years, looking at how they could use the data sets that they have internally and combine that with external data to see which parts of that they could automate, right? And ultimately, it got to the point where you can look across the types of triggers that you want to run on a customer to understand their risk and say, actually, 60, 70, 80% of the things that we do at ongoing due diligence time can be found either as triggers within our own internal data, or they can be found in external data that allows us to keep that customer profile continually up to date. It's a different way of thinking about KYC, it's a different way of thinking about the process, and ultimately that implementation has given them benefits both from an effectiveness point of view, because you're able to spot that risk faster and quicker, you don't have to wait for a refresh cycle, but then also ultimately the goal is for an efficiency ROI where you say, okay, we actually no longer need to do the same level of periodic due diligence on a certain set of our customers that we're confident we can get the data from automatically.
Sounds excellent. Some really good examples there of projects that are really doing well and getting underway and making progress and returning on ROI, which is fantastic. Coming to the end of our time and our last question, let's look into the future. Organizations have begun to think strategically about the pivot towards sort of always-on perpetual KYC. What does the panel think of the operational challenges banks and FIs face, and how would they need to adapt their approaches to achieve this? And we'll have to have some short answers because we are coming to the end of our time. So Eric, let me come to you.
Yeah, I think in order to do this in a short time span, a lot of what we've discussed would have to come into play very quickly. So you'd have to have very standardized view and global view of the client. You would also want a living view of the client. So not necessarily, there's potentially too much risk in only a periodic client view. And to get all of that really practically today, Without having incredibly robust data internally, you would need something like an LEI to make that flow through. I think that's practically a good method and a good approach. I don't, however, think it's necessarily the only one. And organizations can look, dependent on the quality of their data and the structure of the organization and how they operate, at different approaches. But I think it's a very feasible, practical, short-term approach.
Thank you. Joel, what would you say here?
I mean, I agree with what Eric just gone through there. And then previously, Eric also touched on about, focus on the risk and how can you act when you see it and to be visible to you. So in our context as well, we've also just started our journey to research to investigate into the perpetual KYC or continuous monitoring. What we're looking for is a smarter way and a more robust way to understand our risk and react to it during the moment in order to better manage our AML reviews.
Thank you. And Ted, what would you say about perpetual KYC?
Yeah, there's probably three things. There's the people that you need to do this. You're going to need different skill sets for managing exceptions and investigations, because you're going to be throwing red flags at people rather than just process. So that kind of skill set, have you got that? The data flow, and we talked about absolutely, but massively, that's so important, that data flow, the lineage that through the system is connected. And then technology, what you see technology working in functional silos in the bank. And that's technology and probably also governance perspective and maybe culturally. But if you're going to have perpetual KYC, a flow between your screening outputs, between transactions, between in life, however customer lifecycle is managed in the bank, that's really important. And an expectation that data churns quicker than you think it will. Ownership changes are more rapid than every 18 months. And many people just do a review on that basis. So those three areas, the data, the technology, and the people all need to come together.
Okay. Aaron, some final words from you here.
I think I completely agree with what's been said previously. The only thing that I would add is just two angles. From a technology point of view, you absolutely have to have a technology framework that is able to knit together the huge amounts of data that are out there in different silos, in different streams at pace. It's a fundamental building block for being able to do any of this, and having that technology in place is very important. The other piece that I would just talk about is organizational change. I mean, we mentioned kind of having different people who need to do these types of investigations, but it really is, it's not just a technology transformation, it's an organizational transformation, and changing the way that you look at policy and procedure and incremental due diligence and these types of reviews will be very important in making this a reality.
Thank you very much. It's been a great conversation from fundamentals into the future. So thank you all to our speakers. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for joining us, and a very interesting conversation. And let me hand over to Andrew again.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks to the panel. Great panel session that. Sarah, well handled. Appreciate it. Let's move on. This is our final session for the day. We are going to do something a little bit different here. It's a data strategy spotlight, future-proofing your data strategy for today's complex regulatory environment. We've gathered a bunch of experts. We've got an expert panel in advance of today's session. We asked them for their insight on what they see as the main regulations that are causing the biggest data management headaches for financial institutions right now. So we're going to explore these in some detail and look at the data and technology impacts, offer some practical insight into how you can approach and manage them more effectively in your organization. As ever, we do invite you to get involved. You can use Slido to ask us questions, and I'm hoping that you will. I'm seeing this as a kind of mastermind session with audience participation, and myself as Magnus Magnusson. So let's explore these regulations in more detail and find out why they are proving challenging. We've got a lot of people on this session, so what I'm going to do, rather than ask them all to introduce themselves on block, I'll ask them to introduce themselves as I ask them to talk on their selected regulation. Sounds good. So the first one I'm going to go to is the first person to speak will be Kieran from Datactics, and Kieran's going to talk about KYC and AML. So Kieran, why is this regulation on your radar, and what are the data management challenges?
Thanks, Andrew. Hello, everyone. Kieran Seward here. I look after sales and account management at Datactics. So I'm bringing my client insights today rather than necessarily my own. And I would like to point out firstly that I've seen a positive trend, certainly over this last while, that organizations are building foundational data management for the right reasons, from the ground up. So they're no longer being reactive to regulatory compliance, and it's more of one of the outcomes rather than being one of the sole drivers, which I believe is a positive shift. And there's a whole wave of regulations out there which are driving projects in the data quality space. In fact, we're working with Phil and the team at Solidatus on a joint opportunity in Asia, which is a BCBS 239 driver. However, I would say yes, the regulation creating the most data management challenges is know your customer, and that's to do with the identity verification requirement, which is still hugely manually intensive process, and it suffers from a lack of automation, which means it's not only expensive, but it's prone to fat finger data quality errors. And firms are often handling multiple sources of data which have conflicting versions of the truth or slightly different versions of the truth. That can be from legal entity information from their internal sources, their legal entity master, vendor sources, Dun & Bradstreet, Bureau van Dijk type sources, as well as UK Companies House, all, as I say, which have slightly different versions of the truth. That's a really difficult thing to automate. It's a really difficult thing to make sense of without some human in the loop. Add the complexity of the hierarchies associated with those organizations, and that's why I would say KYC.
Thank you so much, Kieran. Next up, we have Philip Dutton of Solidatus. Philip, you're going to talk to us about risk data aggregation and BCBS 239. Same question. Why is the regulation on your radar, and what are the data management challenges?
Yeah, certainly. So Philip Dutton, I'm one of the co-founders and co-CEOs here at Solidatus. And I think really BCBS 239 is one of the the regulations that's really kicked off the whole regulatory focus on data management. Much more than kind of any other regulation that had previously come before. And this is obviously in reaction to the 2007-2008 crisis. And what we've seen is, because this is very much a principles-based regulation, so the principles really are able to be interpreted by the organizations that are kind of being bound by them. And obviously, through time, organizations change. And so therefore, the principles that are being applied to them change based off the organizational view of themselves and the regulator's view of themselves. So I think in the initial, organizations and even the regulator didn't understand the extent of what the ask was. Being able to aggregate data really is kind of quite a high level kind of, I guess, principle that we're looking to be able to achieve, right? Timeliness, completeness, accuracy, etc. But what do you need to put in place to be able to do that across a global GSIB organization where you have hundreds of, systems? And actually that hundreds of systems isn't hundreds, it's tens of thousands of systems, hundreds of thousands of interfaces. And the organization that was 2007, 2008 is now a completely different beast to what it looks like today, because of fintechs, because of microservices, because of cloud, because of AI, etc. We're all changing much, much more quickly. And so the sands that we sit on are actually shifting much quicker than they did in the past. So trying to create something sustainable and that has a manageable cost is really very, very difficult. And so I think as the banks have become more and more focused on data management, and as Kieran said, turning this from being reactive to saying, actually, this is an opportunity for us to, to get our house in order so we can compete better and remove the cost of regulation. Is why this is still one of the primary drivers for data management in the space we see. And I think it will continue to be as both the regulated and the regulator, grapple with this, how and what does good look like? What does the future of data management look like in a financial services space?
Very good. Thank you, Philip. Next up, Malavika Solanki from DSB. Malavika, trade and transaction reporting regulations, all yours.
So a small theme then, not much to talk about. Excellent. So on that note, so there's a couple of things really at the moment that are on people's radars. If we look, well, in particular, there's lots going on in the industry, but if we look around the OTC derivative space, for example, you have reports that came out from the EU late last year that seek to revise elements of the MiFID II regime. You also have reports that came out earlier this year around the EMIR refit pieces, etc., and looking to put those regulations in place. Now, those still have a way to go, and we'll have to see where they land, but there are already changes expected around this. So, for example, one of the things that's been talked about in the MiFID II regime is potentially amending and expanding the systematic internalizer regime. So what banks would need to report, what the buy side would need to report, and how those things will be categorized. In some ways, depending upon where you sit from financial markets perspective, there is a group of institutions that aren't so comfortable with that, and yet there are on the other side, you've got a whole bunch of institutions that are looking forward to some of those changes, at least based on what the information in the public domain. So if we look at some of those things, so we're talking about what's happening in the EU. We've got in the UK a series of consultations that were announced last week that are expected to kick off beginning June this year. Some of the early changes have already been discussed around expectations, so it'll be interesting to see how those develop. And then if one looks at the US, the CFTC 2.0 regulations effectively came into play in September of last year. Those will need to go into effect next year at some point. So the industry, in essence, is managing items on multiple fronts. So that's about the what is going on. If one then talks about, okay, so is there any alignment between those two? How do some of these things dovetail? Because from a challenger's perspective, it's, as many of the speakers talked about before this, it's about data quality, it's about consistency. And if you're going to get consistency, you need to understand what good looks like. How do you remove room for interpretation so that everyone's reporting the same thing in the same way for the same field and the same report? You also need to understand to what level are institutions looking at harmonization. So again, some of the challenges around this is depending on what kind of institution you are, you have firms starting now to think about how do the various data elements that are reportable start to harmonize. So for example, you have a hierarchy between the CFI and the OTC ISIN. There is something called the unique product identifier, and we'll talk more about that later, but that's expected to come into play late next year. So there are now people in industry starting to look at, again, what does that mean, not just from a data element perspective, but to the points made earlier, what does that mean in terms of their workflows? How do you streamline what you need so that you minimize any data errors, but also so you can report in the way you need to report while still looking at your business and your business needs?
Very good. Thank you very much. As I said, small topic, very well handled there. Thank you, Malavika. Next up is James Chen of Tableau. James, you're going to talk to us about SOX compliance.
Hi there. I just want to make sure my mic's working okay, Andrew. Sounding good? Awesome. Yeah. Thanks for having me. So I'm James Chen. I'm a principal solutions engineer with Tableau. I've been with the company about 3 years now. Prior to that, I was a customer as an analytics product owner and as a BI manager. And SOX compliance is very near and dear to my heart, being the guy who had a solution this at a couple of companies prior to joining up and educating my FinServ customers on how they can set up SOX compliance around analytics and reporting specifically. So starting with this, establishing auditability, traceability, and verifiability kind of remain huge challenges in the space of analytics, especially when you have fast-moving self-service analytics and BI tools that are really easy to pick up and come up with semantics, drive things forward, get them out there in front of a large audience of people. So there are a few competing interests at play today, that around business agility and speed to insight, factoring against the needs around governance and controls. So in practice, when individual data practitioners are forced to choose between the two, they're often going to choose to get immediate value from their data first rather than clear every single compliance hurdle which may be placed before them. After all, their primary purpose, their job may be just that, to get value out of data. And compliance kind of takes a second seat. This feeds into the practical challenges of setting up a framework and environment that enables both business agility and compliance at scale. So we know that business agility cannot be achieved when governance processes functionally become red tape. Endless cycles of documentation reviews, promotion pathing, quality checks, testing cycles, they can essentially bring your analytics practice to a crawl. We also know that the absence of governance practices such as content certifications, usage logging, quality audits, etc., lead to a completely ungoverned environment where trust is fragile and data must be used with extreme caution. So in the world of analytics, this can lead to really bad stuff like executives arguing over who has the right number, business decisions being made on uncertified, unverified data sources, and ultimately a culture of data skepticism. So having worked in this space for the past decade, I've seen numerous data governance initiatives account for all the major data systems in a company like the ERP, the CRM, the data lake, the data warehouses, but somehow not adequately account for analytics holistically, especially with the SOX processes. In today's world where analytics are exposed to the majority of office workers, it is critical that trust, certification, verifiability be placed in the hands of the majority of users. And with this in mind, we must ask ourselves when we're designing these processes, where governance approaches are going to be catered towards, who are we going to be doing it for specifically? Is it going to be something where our end users are having trust established upfront or upstream of them? Or is it something where we place them in the center of the process? Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much, James. So next up, we are going to talk about SFDR and EU taxonomy. And we're going to ask Haider and Steph to talk to us about this. Could you introduce yourselves first, guys?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Haider Manon. I'm based at SIX. I'm a regulatory specialist dealing with a number of our regulatory data packages, including the upcoming SFDR release that we are working on.
Hi, and I'm Steph Neelan. I work for Alveo as a Global Strategic Business Development Manager with a particular focus on the buy side and a very special focus on ESG. And I wrote two white papers. One is addressing the challenges in ESG data management. And I just wrote another one where it was like, once you have a score, it's about implementing an ESG rating into your investment process.
Thank you. So back to Haider.
Thank you. And Andrew, I will have to excuse myself after this. I have a hard stop in about 10 minutes. So I'll cover my part and then hopefully Steph can cover the rest. So, you know, SFDR, or Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, is one part of the EU's Sustainable Finance Action Plan. And then this is really there in order to redirect and reorient capital flows towards sustainable investments. It's also there, in essence, to prevent greenwashing. The resulting framework is a set of regulations or disclosure regulations that really aims to streamline the criteria for financial market participants, FMPs, to use, define, measure, and report on the sustainability practices and attributes of the investment products and economic activities that they're carrying out. So the plan is really, you know, a 10-point plan in terms of the reforms that it wishes to introduce. And I'm not going to go through every single thing, but, you know, since we're talking about the data management challenges, I thought I would just center myself on those. And since I only have 2 minutes, this is normally a 3-hour presentation. So with Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, the landscape is changing. There are brand new data points that will pose new challenges for data management in terms of how to handle those. The number one item being investee companies. So these are corporates that will have to report according to a template that the EU has specified. And then investment firms will have to capture information from this template and embed it into their reports and disclosures. That in itself is a very challenging process. And then in addition to SFDR, there's the EU taxonomy as a classification or a dictionary of economic activities that every firm will really have to be following and aligning to in order to make sure that the reporting is consistent across all the investment products, whether they be funds, ETFs, or any such kind of instruments, and even non-publicly traded instruments such as private equity investments, and how they are reported to the larger set of investors and the public. So in addition to all the kind of above named challenges that that you can obviously envisage from such a large change, there is also the EU Green Bond Standard, the EU Ecolabel, and these are posing their own data requirements when it comes to sustainability. And then there's the credit rating agency regulation. So these are all connecting to that very central piece of SFDR and the EU taxonomy. Let's not even start to wander into the area of how the UK will deal with this now that we are a third country to the EU, because we will likely be diverging and following our own set of principles when it comes to sustainability.
Great, thank you very much, Haidar. Over to you, Steph.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot, and we can see that it's going to affect almost everyone. So what do I mean by that? It already is into effect since March 2021. And the regulation asks you to report by this time next year. So it's going to have a big impact on asset managers, banks, brokers, funds. And you're asking, why is it a challenge? Well, it is a challenge because your official website, your fact sheets, your prospectus, all these things have to be compliant. And so it basically boils down to whether you're going to be a green fund or a light green fund or a gray fund. And if you're not compliant, you become a gray fund. And there's other regulation coming in that might basically ask investors to say, do you want to invest in anything green? Then if so, all the gray funds are not able to pitch to you anymore. So that's sort of the stick behind this whole regulation that will come into play. But what do you need to do in order to get compliant, either to be light green or green? You're probably going to have to multi-source from a lot of data from many places. You're probably going to have an ESG compliant, normalized data model to manage all this. You're probably going to have to link all your securities of all the different asset classes to the investee company data. And then you're going to have to calculate some metrics on the back of this in your reports. So you probably need some kind of market data management system to sustain this regulation, let alone to compete. And everyone's doing it. So I think that sort of sums it up.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much, Steph. And last but not least, we turn to Robert at West Highland. Robert, you're going to talk about Consolidated Audit Trail.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I'm Robert Wallace. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer for West Highland Support Services, and we do global market data consulting and outsourcing. We manage the entire life cycle of market data at large global banks and broker dealers. So Consolidated Audit Trail, just a briefer on that. Back in May 6th of 2010, the US market experienced an event called the flash crash. It resulted in a massive swing in equity options and futures prices, resulting, I think, a swing of close to 20% in a matter of minutes. This caused, obviously, the extreme volatility was a challenge for participants to deal with. There was significant losses racked up by some investors, and generally it shook confidence in US markets. Determining the cause of the flash crash proved extremely difficult for regulators, since the trading was fragmented across all exchanges, options, futures, and as well as cash equities. And ultimately, it took several months, I believe 3 or 4 months, to determine the actual cause and the parties involved in sort of kicking off the event. So in 2012, the SEC kicked off an initiative called the Consolidated Audit Trail, which was to build a really the largest centralized database of equity and options trading activity in the world to aid with market surveillance. So what are the challenges in pulling something like this off? So first off, I think data harmonization. I heard a lot of folks on this call describe the challenges there. I mean, at a base level, even something like a bid and an ask are reported differently based on the participant. So as just a simple example, a bid and ask done on an exchange floor is reported differently than a bid and ask reported in an electronic order book. Representative orders, so these are pooled orders that broker dealers take as agency order flow, are reported differently based on company, and that might be just based on the internal systems that they've operated, as well as who the participant is, whether they're on different legs of the trade. So from an industry perspective, just harmonizing what to report and how to report it is a significant challenge. And the regulators and some of the market participants realize this is a problem, and they're actively working to get that sorted. Next thing, data hygiene and error handling. So these things are critical. So when you upload, as a market participant, when you actually upload your data at the end of the trading day, there are automated processes at the CAT that kick back error reports that need to be resolved. In many cases, since these are all new regulation, middle and back office personnel may struggle to deal with these types of errors. They have to reach out to counterparties at other trading firms, because you're reporting a trade that involves, in some cases, 2 or 3 different organizations, which may have reported the trade as well and might report it differently. So that's gonna obviously create some challenges. And when we're talking about error reports, some of these error reports, if they're handled, we're talking about millions of records that need to be resolved in a matter of days, and really there's no way to do that without significant automation added into the overall process. One of the next steps in the CAT is adding PII data related to investors and large traders. For the most part today, I'll kind of summarize, calling the data most of the data reported to the CAT is public information. It's not readily available, but it's not confidential. It's in general. When the requirement to report the actual trader, their personal identifiable information or their specific company information happens, companies and regulators are going to have to take a strong look at that. Obviously, being able to control access to that data set is essential. And also, since many of those traders are foreign, we're going to have to comply with all foreign GDPR standards, for each country where those traders reside. So that's going to be a significant challenge. And then lastly, just the sheer volume of data. So the CAT does not replace the firm's requirement to record the same information in their books and records for other regulatory reporting. So this is a duplication, and in some case a multiplication of data storage requirements, which is going to have major effects on how IT organizations and technology organizations operate. So that's the CAT.
Very good, thank you. I've always wondered what the cat was, and now I know.
It's not a cute, furry little, animal anymore.
Not that anymore, no. Everything's changed. I'm mindful of time, everyone. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go straight to the Slido questions because we have a few coming in. So let me just throw them out, and we'll get some volunteers to respond. So the first one of these says, we're starting to migrate to the cloud for regulatory data management. What have you seen as the most common mistakes when shifting to cloud-based working, and how can we avoid them? Has anyone seen any mistakes in terms of the practitioners have made as they look to deploy cloud for regulatory data management?
I mean, I think I'm happy to jump in on this one if you like. I think the biggest failing is the failing to effectively plan for a migration to cloud. I think, where we're looking to take lots and lots of complex connected data sets and move them into a cloud environment, especially as has been mentioned, once you start to move into the cloud, you've got multi-jurisdictional concerns. It's not the same as it's all sitting in my data center in New York. Now it potentially could be in data centers all over the world. You don't know where that is. And so you need to start to understand your jurisdictional restrictions, but you also need to understand the economics of the cloud. You need to understand that the cloud is designed to make money for the cloud vendors, and therefore an inefficient plan of migration can mean that it can cost you a lot more in the initial than it should from your data center. So understanding how you move your data into the cloud, is data going to be moving up and down between on-prem and cloud, again, starts to bring in a whole set of kind of additional business concerns, not just from a data management perspective, and then trying to really harmonize and move the data that you want to efficiently, again, comes down to that plan. The cloud should not be a lift and shift in the same way that kind of a lot of on-prem data lake kind of activities have occurred, because effectively then you're just moving kind of a big pile of data into another data source somewhere else. You're just moving the problem off premise into the cloud. Really, you've got to look at consolidation, that harmonization. Effectively, we're trying to modernize, right? We want to get the correct data in the cloud for the correct purpose. And I think that's the challenge. Plan how you're going to execute. That's really critical.
Thanks, Philip. Anyone else on cloud?
I think it's been said all by Philip. I just want to use a simple analogy. It's like if you got closet space and you got too little closet space, which is always the case, but you think you can now move it into an even bigger place, it still doesn't mean that all your stuff is neatly ordered. And I think you need to do that first before you start to put it somewhere else in the cloud, because otherwise it's just going to be an even bigger mess than it was before.
Living in the city, that resonates with me, Steph. Thank you. Right, next question. Regulators talk about easing the burden of the regulatory challenge. How do you see this panning out in practice? Seems like a tall order to me. Does anyone want to take a stab at it?
I can kick off if that helps. And then...
Go for it.
So from what we can see, looking at some of the reports that have come out recently, there seems to be a recognition that there has to be some kind of harmonization and also rationalization to some degree. So there seem to be early suggestions out there in writing around trying to streamline what institutions need to report, so that in essence, if they've got certain data elements, there seems to be a view these days where certain regulators are starting to look at whether they could reuse existing data more efficiently and for more purposes. And so I think that is something we're likely to see more of. And the other thing is this idea around harmonization, where we're starting to see from a number of jurisdictions this idea of actually starting to look at how the various data elements dovetail with each other. And is there an efficient way to be able to get the level of transparency regulators want in a way that also works for multiple types of market participants? Because sometimes what happens is what works for one group doesn't always work for someone else. And while you can't please everybody, trying to find that balance is something that seems to be much more of a public move towards.
Yeah, do you think, Malavika, that given that the regulators have been, they didn't offer practitioners much quarter during the pandemic, really. Do you think the report last week from the Bank of England acknowledging the difficulty in gathering data for regulatory reporting is something of an olive branch, maybe?
I think it's at the very least a recognition, right, that there were constraints for some institutions. I think what's likely to come after is an evaluation of what led to those constraints. How much of that requires the institution adapting, how much of that requires the market structure adapting, because there's going to be different levels of change here, I think, as time comes. But you're right, Andrew, with that.
Very good. Anyone else on the on easing the regulatory burden?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to jump in here. I think, you know, in terms of the regulation, one of the things that we've certainly seen from clients is that there is so many regulations across so many regulators that actually it becomes a huge burden on the organization just to fulfill that obligation. So therefore, like any organization, they prioritize. And so they're prioritizing the regulation either by kind of who is banging on the door loudest or the one who has the biggest stick to wield. And that's not really what regulation should be about, right? This regulation really is designed to encourage behavior, which means that, you know, the organization should be trying to create better processes, better data management across the organization, not kind of be thinking, well, I just need to tick box, you know, GDPR, and then I'm just going to have to tick box, you know, CCPA, and not actually bringing this into things. So I think the regulators are certainly seeing that, you know, by them working together to create that bit more of, you know, a consistent message where you're not asking for the same data for 3 different things, but actually you want the same data across 3 different regulators, you know, trying to bring a bit of uniformity to that. And that's really positive. I think the regulators are also looking at, you know, data collection methodologies. How can we collect this data more efficiently? You know, reports are great, but reports, you know, there is a set, as was kind of mentioned by Malavika, was, you know, you've got different fields meaning different things interpreted by different people. What we need is more of a standard harmonized kind of view of that data. And so they're looking at how they can bring the data in, making this much more of an automated process where, you know, machine readable regulations mean that you can machine interpret those regulations and implement those into the organization. So I think there is definite, you know, understanding that if we're going to engineer data better, we actually have to engineer better. And so it's, you know, let's look at each of the pieces of the puzzle and work out how do we do, you know, the different steps better.
Very good. Last question then. This is a question about BCBS 239, but I think it possibly applies more broadly. And the questioner says we still hear a lot about BCBS 239, and after the past year, we have felt pressure on to deliver more quickly in terms of data to solve business problems, and we need to revisit some of our processes. What advice do you have for practitioners on maintaining compliance? So I guess there's greater pressure to deliver data for the business, and there's the ongoing pressure for granularity and cleanliness, should we call it, from the regulators. So how do we remain compliant, everyone?
I'm happy to let someone else jump in, but otherwise I will.
Why don't you go for it, Philip, while others gather their thoughts, if that's what they're doing?
Certainly. So I think, you know, let's look at this. What we want to really think about is not seeing them as 2 different things. So what they should be thinking about is how do we reuse effort across the organization? So I am obligated to do this thing, to understand my data at a sufficient level of granularity. So that meeting that obligation should actually enable the business to use their data more efficiently to drive business. And that's really I think the key is not to see this as, you know, let's just meet that regulatory thing. This is the opportunity to change how we do things through process, through, you know, data capture, through, you know, the whole data management life cycle. It's the opportunity to use mandatory spend to actually get some you know, real business tangible benefits from it. For me, it's all about reuse. Don't take GDPR and think of it as completely different to CCPA or from, you know, CPRA or LGPD. They're all privacy regulations. They all kind of want the same thing. There's a huge overlap. Do one and then do the delta of the rest. And therefore you're not re-implementing the same thing over and over again. You're just doing deltas. And it works for for most regulations, know your customer gives you a whole lot of benefits across the entirety of the organization just from doing that, one part of regulation. So I think reuse is key.
Very good.
Yeah, just to back up what Phil is saying there, we've seen clients in the past, banking organizations who are taking, over here they're doing FSCS, single customer view reporting, and that's an entirely siloed team, an entirely siloed process. And then over here, they're doing basically the same thing, but for GDPR marketing consents. So it's about reusing, doing that one thing right centrally, organized by a data management, team centrally, common data standards, doing it once, and as Philip says, reusing that effort, is creating efficiencies.
And just to add on to what Kieran just said, using data centrally, you want to create basically one golden copy. And I know it's very appealing to take that data down in your team and do something with it, but it has to be centrally in one place, and such that the rest of the organization can use it as well. And that having that data in a central way is, I think, the most important element. And that means that data sometimes resides outside your systems, or you just fill your systems with that data, but they are not the master of the data. You have to have one central system that feeds everything downstream.
Very good. Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up there for this panel. So let me first thank our panelists for their generosity. Kieran, Malavika, Steph, Haida, who's now just left us, Philip, Robert and James. Thanks everyone. It was a great session. It's definitely a bookmarkable session there for a quick hit, a whirlwind tour of the regulatory data environment. Give us a really good view of the challenges facing practitioners in our space. So I really appreciate your contributions today. Thank you. So let's see, I think we are coming to the end of today's session. And indeed the event, as it were. So let me just say a few words, mostly of thanks to all of our speakers. We've had a fantastic session today. I think at the beginning of yesterday's session, I remarked that it was the first time I hadn't seen regulation as a sort of primary headline item for yesterday. It certainly was today, so it came back with a vengeance today. So great sessions, and I think set the scene really nicely for our upcoming RegTech Summit event, I think in June. So yes, thanks to all our expert speakers, and of course to our sponsors, that is ANA, Alveo, Alatus, Bureau van Dijk, QSIP Global Services, Derivatives Service Bureau, Avera, Solidatus, Quantexa, Six, Tableau, and West Highland in, I think, alphabetical order there. I've been asked to ask you, the audience, to complete our delegate feedback form. We appreciate your feedback. It helps us to plan future events. So do take the time to fill out the form. If you have missed any sessions from today or indeed yesterday, they are available on demand for a limited time. So you can go and take a look, or maybe share with some of your colleagues. And you should not forget to sign up for the various data management insight webinars and events that we've got coming up over the next few months. All details are on our website. Incidentally, we are hoping to be back in New York on September 30th for our DMS New York event. And we hope to have a live physical event in December 2nd in London for our DMS London event. Fingers crossed these will happen. We'd be keen to know your appetite and ability to attend these events in person. So if you feel like dropping us a note, please do so. Let us know if you would like to attend a physical event. There will be a virtual element to these events as we go forward, whatever the case. So there will be a live streaming element to those, so you will be able to attend in person if you, you will be able to watch virtually through our platform if you can't attend in person. So yeah, I think that's all the housekeeping. I'd like to thank the A-Team team, in particular Lorna, Jerry-Ann and Sarah for stepping in there. Please, thanks guys, great job today. Very seamless and a great session. So on that note, I'll leave it there and wish you all a good rest of the day. See you next time. Bye-bye.